Good morning, everyone. We are about to start. I think we'll start in the next 3 minutes or so. Just giving it a few more minutes for a few others to join in, and then we will officially start. But welcome and talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are joining us from today. And welcome to the third annual She Summit. We're so excited to have all of you join us for today's discussion. And this year's summit is hosted by For Equality and supported by Concern Worldwide Malawi. This year's summit runs under the theme From 16 Days to 365 Days, Reimagining Financing and Accountability for Ending Violence Against Women and Girls. The theme this year seeks to ask critical questions on financing and accountability for ending violence and propose alternatives that democratize funding and shift power to the grossly underfunded community level organizers and movements who need the most support. This summit is also very special this year because it coincides with the 30-year anniversary of the Global 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence campaign. This milestone is an opportunity for us all to reflect and reimagine funding for ending violence against women and girls efforts. I will be a facilitator today. My name is Jessica Mandanda, and I am the communications lead with For Equality. We have an exciting lineup for you today with amazing speakers and experts from across Africa who are here to join our two very high-level panels that will be hosting the discussions on reimagining financing and reimagining accountability. But first, I would like to welcome Mr. Wilson Chivanga, who is the Executive Director for Equality, to share his welcome remarks. Over to you, Wilson.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for inviting me to this space and to be able to share some brief remarks. I hope you can all hear me well. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Honorable Minister of Gender, Community Development and Social Welfare in Malawi, the Honorable Dr. Patricia Kaliati. Honorable, it's always a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much for always making time to be with us and to contribute to these conversations that we have. You have been such a strong supporter, and we really acknowledge and honor your support. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of the Principal Secretary for Administration in the Ministry of Gender, Community Development and Social Welfare, Mr. Isaac Katopola, and all the officials from the Ministry of Gender who are joining us today. Thank you so much for being here. Also want to say welcome to the chairperson of the NGO Gender Coordinating Network, Madam Barbara Banda, to our partners concerned, Malawi Country Director Yusuf Jogesai, and Chris Connolly, the Programs Director. Thank you for your support and for being here as well. I'd like to acknowledge our Programs Director for Equality as well, Shalom Zimunya. Thank you for all your hard work into making this happen. Also to acknowledge our speakers, our panelists who are joining us today from all over the continent. Friends, thank you so much for joining us as well. It's a pleasure to have you in this meeting. But also really want to thank everyone who is joining this call from wherever you are joining us from across the continent. We really honor and acknowledge you, and thank you for being in this space. Without further ado, I just want to give some brief remarks, but I want to start off with just a reflection on the journey of this She Summit. As most of you would know, this is the third edition of the She Summit, and we have been hosting this summit physically or for the last 2 editions, but this year we had to transition to a virtual summit. And I remember the first She Summit, we focused on safe schools. How do we end violence, in schools? And it was really a great summit that we had. We had over 250 participants who did join us for that physical meeting. And then in 2019, again, we had the She Summit. And that year we focused on ending sexual violence in the world of work. So we're really pushing a decent work agenda with that. Unfortunately, 2020, we could not have the She Summit, but we are glad that we're able to have the She Summit happening again this year. And under a very exciting theme for us, which is reimagining financing and accountability for EVOG. And I know we'll dive deeper into that as we go along the day. But I'm really excited that we're convening today and having such a critical conversation, especially at such a critical juncture in the world, really globally, because I think one of the key things that we are now beginning to realize is as the globe, we now need to learn how to coexist with the COVID-19 pandemic. I know the conversations we had last year in different platforms, a lot of us were talking about how are we recovering from the pandemic. But now I think we're beginning to realize that probably this recovery effort means we need to find ways of coexisting with this pandemic that has ravaged the globe so devastatingly. And what does that mean for us? What does that mean for the fight against the second or the shadow pandemic, which is gender-based violence. We were all hoping that as COVID-19 subsides, then we would also begin to see a decrease in the incidence and cases of gender-based violence. But now that we need to think about coexisting with this pandemic, what does that then look like for the shadow pandemic? So that's a big question that we are thinking about, and I hope we will unpack today in this session as well. But another thing which is critical to highlight why the summit is so critical right now is I think we all know that gender-based violence is exacerbated during times of crisis, and we've all seen that. I think we all know the statistics around what is going on. I was going to share some statistics today, but I do believe all of us are aware. But I want to highlight something I read yesterday. Some statistics that Amnesty International sent out yesterday on Twitter, and it was 4 countries. It was South Africa, Zambia, and I think Mozambique as well. Malawi was not one of the countries, but they were really highlighting the incidence of various forms of violence against women and girls that have happened in over the last few months. And the numbers are shocking. And I remember retweeting that, and someone said to me, this is so shocking. And they were asking around why Malawi was not there and whether our numbers were even worse for those of us in Malawi. And I think for me, it was a sobering moment to say, we have been talking about it, but I think we need to pay extra attention because violence against women and girls is not decreasing as we thought it would. Maybe with the COVID situation getting better, things are getting worse. So how do we fix that? How do we come in to ensure that we create a world which is safer for women and girls? I think the last thing that I would just want to touch on in this welcoming remarks is the 2 big questions probably that we have for this summit are around financing and accountability. A few months ago, I wrote a piece which was published in the Response. And in that piece, I was talking about or analyzing how development aid is and some of the statistics, which AWID and other, feminist organizations and funds have put out show that less than 1% of development aid actually goes to women-led, women-serving organizations globally. I referenced in that article that is it in 2016 of the over 40 billion, which was ODA, development assistance that came that was earmarked for the global south. Only less than 30% actually reached the continent and actually worked in the continent. And then out of that 30%, very little came towards ending violence against women and girls, less than 1%. Grassroots feminist organizations and movements are the most underfunded, yet they are the ones who are on the ground and really doing the work. So for us, the big question around financing is how do we reimagine that? How do we shift power and make sure that power in the form of resources is shifted to grassroots organizations and movements that need it the most, who are doing the most, who are responding to violence, on a daily basis. The Generation Equality Forum ended with huge commitments that were made. Over 40 billion was committed. A huge chunk of that was committed towards gender-based violence. I know for a fact that the United States of America committed over 1.1 billion towards efforts to fight gender-based violence. But then again, the question is how much of those commitments are actually going to reach the global south? And then if we take it deeper, how much of the money, the finances that reach the global south actually go to grassroots organizations who need that money the most? So those are big questions that we need to grapple with. On the side of accountability, I think the questions we need to ask are, what frameworks do we have? Are they working? And then how do we begin to reimagine that to ensure that there is stronger accountability across all levels, from the donors, development partners, big global institutions? How do we hold them accountable for the commitments they have made, but also for ensuring that the money is going where it needs to go to? How do we hold our governments accountable for increased investment towards efforts to end GBV? How do we hold governments accountable for policy implementation to ensure that we have strong legal frameworks, that protect women and girls? But then how do we also hold ourselves accountable as civil society actors, as grassroots movements, as activists? Are we actually implementing? Are we doing the work we're supposed to do? What is driving our responses, our implementation? Is it evidence-based? So it's accountability across the spectrum, and we really need to think through that. So without further ado, I just wanted to throw these thoughts so that we start the process of thinking about this, and I know our amazing panelists will dive deeper into that. So without wasting more time, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have all of you, and we look forward to really rich conversations, which will continue beyond the summit as well. So thank you, and over to you, Jessica.
Thank you very much, Wilson, for those opening remarks. I will now call on the chairperson of the NGO Gender Coordination Network, Madam Barbara Banda, to share her remarks with us. Over to you, Madam Barbara.
Thank you very much. The keynote speaker, Honorable Dr. Patricia Kaliati, our Minister of Gender, Community Development and Social Welfare, the PS of Administration, Mr. Isaac Katopola, and all officials from government institutions, the Executive Director of Development participants here present, or this is a very good occasion and pertinent questions that active, but we are still confronted with these huge figures. The Amnesty International report you are talking about, the evil of gender-based violence is with us. This tells us that this can no longer be an annual event where we gather and make speeches at the launch and at the end of the period. We have to harness the momentum that we have created wide and far in our country and beyond, to just say, what are we learning from this and how can we ride on that momentum moving forward? I'm a social entrepreneur, and I started an organization called Srhr, and literally meaning that each woman is my sister. I can depend on her. I can tell them my story. It's a grassroots knowledge about giving these women at grassroots level real tools to fight, judo, netball, and entrepreneurship, building their ability, their economic ability to stand on their own, because we know that poverty is one of the underlying issues that drives GBV. So through the support of friends and family last year, or at the peak of the first wave of COVID, I started a soup kitchen, and it started with like 20 children, because children were not accused to an extent that majority of them were young girls with babies on their back, because our focus was babies, school children, and the elderly. But because the young girls had to bring their babies, they also became beneficiaries of this project. But we know what COVID has done. Those that were supporting us could not continue because also they lost their livelihoods. So because of that global economic problem, we are finding hardships with those remittances. So we can see that a grassroots organization like Srhr should be considered as an important that is not access resourcing opportunities because the widespread practices, funding practices, are exclusive. They cannot meet the criteria. They do not have the information that allows them to be able to access this funding. The figures that Wilson just shared with us about how much of global ODA gets to this website. Only 15% is directed, and less than 1% is earmarked directly to the global south. So too often, the main sources of development and small group challenging these northern and larger organizations. But we know when we talk GBV, the statistics are west where there is poverty, where there is marginalization. Ironically, some existing resources and donors do not provide this kind of support. They are just who provide this kind of support. They are hard to find. You find philanthropists usually that are individuals who make calls or who support certain specific areas in their locality because of that defined focus. It then leaves out them and provide often for those that need it most. So I want us to continue lobbying for the line ministry to be well resourced. We have been saying that time immemorial. So we activists to take that is an ongoing activity that budgets. We ensure that the ministry that looks after gender issues is being funded adequately so that they can do their work. And also building the skills and capacities of women grassroots organizations like Srhr, because Srhr can provide immediate support. My experience was that a woman was stranded in the middle of the night, was physically abused, and she ran to the next neighbor and she got support. And the next day she wanted money to go back to the village. The women quickly collected money from each other and supported her to go. So this is what we are saying. How can we make grassroots support, grassroots institutions and grassroots women more, give them the resources and enable them services from private sector, which is one sector that we don't talk to, but these are the resources in our productive resources, for example, programs. And also this for women. How can we start tracking their budgets to ensure that CSR is also supporting EVAG activities? So EVAG will be sustained through democratization of funding. And we can even see from the recent outcry by our Nigerian sister who was talking about the vaccine injustice. You know, we know the mantra from COVID that if one of us is not safe, we are also, all of us are not safe. So this is how it goes with Vogue. If one woman is not safe, if one girl is not safe, this country is not a safe country. So let's not be surprised when this evil persists. It's because we are not putting the funds where they can make the most impact. So I want to end by calling upon all of us to start being accountable and holding each other accountable so that then we can make meaningful impact as a successful interaction today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Barbara Banda, for those very powerful remarks. And indeed, we do need to start holding each other accountable, as well as the stakeholders accountable for the state of funding and financing for programming and advocacy for ending violence against women. I will now call upon our keynote speaker, our Minister of Gender, Community Development and Social Welfare, Dr. Patricia Cariati, to share with us her keynote address.
Thanks so much, the Director of Ceremonies, the PS for Gender, Madam Makumua, Madam Barbara Banda, the Chairperson of NGO GCN, and Mr. Yusuf Zoyenzai, Country Director of Concern Worldwide, Madam Emi Kalia, the Executive Director of Malawi Human Rights Resource Center, and also the Chairperson of African Women's Leaders Network, Mr. Wilson Chivwanga, Executive Director for Equality, Madam Murugai Sharon Zmunya, the Program Director for Equality, all government officials, heads and representatives of local and international NGOs present, the members of the media, and all my seniors present this morning. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the third annual She Summit under the theme From 16th to 365 Days, Reimagining Financing and also Accountability for Ending Violence Against Women and Girls, end of quote. First and foremost, let me thank all of you gathered here for the welcome that you have accorded to all of us at this auspicious occasion. This shows that you are personally committed to the promotion of gender equality and also empowerment of women in Malawi. The strengthening and also harnessing of our collective voice and action to end violence against women and girls summit is convened annually by For Equality. The global 16 days of activism against gender-based violence strives to provide a platform for thought, leadership, networking, and also deep conversation to shape the agenda for ending violence against women and girls. The summit, Your Excellencies and all my seniors, also prioritizes youth inclusion as an essential, yet after lacking component of decision-making in Africa. And this is a very important aspect, much as we know that we, the older generation, need to pass the mantle to the youthful generation so that there is a continuity in the fight against gender-based violence. And this is what Wilson Chivwanga is looking forward, because he's been having a number of programs for the youthful young women and girls, and we thank you very much for all the programs, the equality, the gender equality, or the generation equality, all these programs we are setting aside that women, the young women are supposed to be empowered, and we are very ready to pass on the mantle to you, our young women and men. It is no secret that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women and girls. Between August and September 2021, the country recorded 2,301 GBV cases, with 247 being cases of defilement. The figure is alarming in a society which has value for our daughters, our sisters, and mothers, and this cannot be our reality. Hence, we need to act together to ensure that safety of women and girls beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is why we worked with the Plan Malawi, and we were on crossroads. But some of us, also some of the comments from the Twitter, was not even appetizing, so to say. People, they think that maybe those things are not happening. The problem, maybe we are focusing very much in the cities. We are not in the rural areas that we go to witness what is happening with our women. We have a case of that nature which we portrayed when we were at the crossroads in Queen Elizabeth Hospital, that a woman was hacked. So when we make up ourselves to say we need to end some of these, the women, the young women of the Twitter thinking that we're just exaggerating or we are laughing off over those who are victimized. No, we are just telling the nation and the men to say we need to stop this because women are going through that. It's not an issue of laughing of those. It's not an issue of imagining or whatever, but it's a real situation, a reality which is happening on the ground. Although COVID-19 is taking us back and also less than decades worth of working that has been done to respond to violence against women and girls, we must commend the efforts being made by different actors to build the resilience and also curb the impacts on the pandemic. Your Excellencies and my seniors, we must acknowledge that we cannot eradicate violence against women and girls without adequate funding and also strengthening accountability mechanisms. And this is why we are having problems to implement some of the legislations which we have or disseminating the legislations we have in the rural areas because of resources. It is indeed saddening to note that in 2018 and only 0.12% of our humanitarian funding went towards programming to prevent and also respond to GBV. And as of October 2020, only 0.5% of global humanitarian response plan for COVID-19 was dedicated to GBV prevention and response. Less than 1% of funding barely constitutes an afterthought. I know we have so many questions to ask inadequate funding for the gender-based violence and also gender sector in general. This third annual summit seeks to ask critical questions on financing and also accountability for ending violence against women and girls, and they propose alternatives that democratize funding and also shift power to the grossly underfunded community level organizers and the movements who need the most support. Let me assure you about the government's commitment. We can hold each other's hands to lobby for gender responsive budget, which is designated to mainstreaming gender dimensions into all stages of the budget cycle through analyzing the different impacts of the national budget and the local budget allocations, expenditures, as well as revenues, policies on women and girls and men and boys. It makes economic sense to adopt a GRB because this is an effective and efficient mechanism to ensure that limited resources have maximum impact by targeting resources towards removing barriers that obstruct the full potential of women of all segments of the population across sectors. My ministry is pushing for institutionalization of GRB in government budget planning stages. So far, we have managed to engender the budget guidelines, which is the main guide to allocation of budgets. We are still engaging with the Treasury to do more on funding allocations for the gender sector. This is a listening government, and we are optimistic that the gender sector will be considered in funding allocations. And when you be consulted also, you might also talk about the budget of the Ministry of Gender that is supposed to be topped up. And I'm sure that when the consultation reaches your table, you do that accordingly. Apart from issues of funding, let me draw your attention that this summit is special because it coincides with the 30 years anniversary of the Global 16 Days of Activism against the gender-based violence campaign, which was launched on 25th November in Katabe. This year, this milestone is an opportunity it is an opportunity for us all to reflect and also reimagine funding for ending violence against women and girls' efforts. In the Generational Equality Forum, commitments were made by the government to increase funding for women movement, but the NGOs and CSO who also committed to mobilize resources for the same cause. And we've been working hand in hand with them. We thank the NGO and all the non-government organizations, which are not even leaving the Ministry of Gender aside, but we move together in all programs. So as you are looking up to government, we rely on you to also be mobilizing resources for the fight against gender-based violence, as you've been doing. And that's why we are applauding you. All some of these programs are being implemented because of your support and because of the resources which you've been providing to the Ministry of Gender. So thank you very much. And all these information sharing, some of the mobilizations, they've been done because of you. May God bless you and remember in a special way. And it is my prayer that let the pocket be full for some of these programs for the 16 days beyond 365 days which are looking forward. My ministry is always keen to work with you all, our stakeholders, on issues of equality as women empowerment, and be assured of the requirement support you may need. As you are aware, my ministry is the lead agency and also policy holders in gender mainstreaming, and also coordinates national efforts to ensure that gender is mainstreamed in all levels as a way of addressing forward development indicators that are hindering development. In this regard, my ministry will always be there to provide direction on the policy and legal frameworks on gender and women empowerment through the national gender policy. The gender equality and the legal framework on gender and women empowerment through the national gender policy, the Gender Equality Act, the Wills and Inheritance Act, the Marriage, Divorce and Family Relations Act, the Trafficking in Persons and the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act. This is to make sure that women and girls are protected against gender-based violence. Further to this, my ministry has referral structures in place where issues of gender-based violence can be reported. On this, I would like to salute you and through you to a number of non-government organizations who are helping us on the referral, who are helping us in the safe space, who are helping us in some of these reporting mechanisms. And we need not to let it go within the 6 days of activism as we are celebrating the 30 years down the line. To thank our partners, and here you are. Kivunga, please take my thanksgiving to all non-government organizations, big, local, as well as international, for the support. So these include the Community Victim Support Unit and also the District Social Affairs, as well as gender officers, and a number of people who are supporting all these programs from non-governmental organizations. In conclusion, it is a pleasure to be here with you all. I look forward to hearing the critical issues that arise from this dialogue. We, as the Minister of Gender, Community Development and Social Affairs, and when I say we include you people who we work hand in hand together. Excuse me, the local as well as the international NGOs, we are all in the Ministry of Gender. So we salute you, you are my seniors, and I depend on you. So we, as a block of Ministry of Gender, Community Development and Social Affairs, also look forward. We look forward to working with a number of people to address the continuing shadow pandemic and to attain gender equality in Malawi. And also, I would like to thank for equality the chairperson and also the executive director for organizing this She Summit and a number of partners who will come in to support this program. We are looking forward that you need to continue working with for equality, because they're having a number of programs which are going to even initiate a number of issues coming forward and then even ending gender-based violence. So I'd like to thank you very much for this meeting. Let's keep having it even beyond the 16 days of activism. With these remarks, I now officially open the She Summit May God bless you and remember you as you are holding hands together for ending gender-based violence against women and girls. I remain blessed. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, the Minister of Gender, Community Development and Social Welfare, for that very powerful keynote address. We will now move on to our very first plenary session, which is the first panel discussion, which is covering the topic from 16 to 365 days, reimagining financing for ending violence against women and girls. I will now hand over to Nyercia, who will be moderating this session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica, for a good job so far. Thank you to the Honorable Minister for those very powerful remarks. Thank you to Madam Barbara Banda, and thank you to Wilson Chivanga as well, our ED. And so I'm Rugaresha Lomzimunya, and I'm going to be moderating this session on reimagining financing for ending violence against women and girls. And we're also calling this session, Where is the Money? Because I think that's really the key question in all of this. When we take into consideration the fact that a third of the world's population will experience violence, a third of women around the world will experience violence at some point in their lives, whether this is through child marriage, which in essence is rape, whether it's through sexual violence, or whether it's through violent intimate partner violence or behavior. At some point in their lives, a third of women will experience violence. And this is irrespective of the age, because we have children as young as a few months old experiencing this sort of violence. We have people as old as 80 experiencing this sort of violence. And so it does not take into account your age. We have people of different religions who are being subjected to this sort of violence. So it also does not matter what religion you represent or you stand for. It doesn't matter where you're from, which part of the world you're from, whether you're from the first world countries, third world countries, regardless of your socioeconomic status, everybody is at risk. And a third of the world's population has already been suffering from violence in one way or the other. And so I think the question now becomes, is there really adequate funding that is being directed to fighting and ending the different forms of violence to match the need that is there to fight this sort of violence? And I think generally the consensus is no. People are feeling that we don't really have enough funds that are being allocated to ending violence. And where the funds are being allocated, it's a very, umbrella approach, and the different types of violence are not being really taken into account for looking at the different specifics of the different types of violence. And so this session today, I'm really excited. We have 4 panelists joining us, 4 incredible Africans who are doing amazing work across the continent. And so they'll be joining us on this panel today to really give their insights and answer some of the questions around where is the money for ending violence against women and girls across the different sectors. And so we have Tikala on the call, we have Nelly, we have Dr. T, as we often call her, Tadiwanashe. We also have Oluwatobi who's joining in. And so I'm just going to give them all about 30 seconds just to introduce us, tell us their name, and just how they identify. How would you want to introduce yourself? So are you the ED? Are you the founder? Are you, just a little bit about the work that you're doing, and then we'll get right into the questions. So we'll start with Nelly, we'll go to Tikala, we'll go to Dr. T, and then we'll finish off with Oluwatobi. So please go ahead and just tell us your name and what you do. Thank you.
So, good morning to all of us, and really excited to be a panel in this. Comrade Wilson and Shalom, you're doing an amazing job. Just listening to the keynote speakers, you guys have amazing support from your government's system. My name is Nelly Nyercia. I'm the Executive Director of Reproductive Health Network Kenya, a network of healthcare providers working in about 43 counties in Kenya, and mainly focusing on comprehensive sexuality education, and of course, GBV being a key component. And we also work with young people, appreciating the role the young people, play, and also knowing that most of the times they are violated and it is not spoken about. So we have built them as champions, as advocates, as the voices that is so much needed when addressing some of the gender-based violence issues. I'll stop at that. I know I can speak till evening. Thank you, Shalom.
Great, thank you so much, Nelly. Tikala, please introduce yourself.
Thanks, thank you so much. And thank you for equality and even our Honorable Minister in Malawi. I think this is such a powerful platform and discussion, especially with She Summit, and really excited to be part of this discussion today. So brief introduction about myself. I'm Tikala Etai. I am the Executive Director of a youth-led organization called Srhr Liberty that really equips young people, especially adolescent girls and young people, young women, to be agents of change within their own communities. So we give them skills and resources to really lead their own initiatives within their own communities. I'm also the former chairperson of the global movement She Decides. I've been doing a lot of work globally as well with different regions and countries around movements and girls and women's rights. I'm a lawyer by profession, so doing a lot of work around human rights, especially when it comes to women and girls' rights, is my expertise. And that's a little bit about me.
Great, thank you, Tikala. Dr. T, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Shalom. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for asking me to be here and to be part of the panel with such amazing women as well. I'm really excited. The name is Tadwana Sheburukai Matutu, well, famously called Dr. Tadiwa. I'm the executive director of Mandla Foundation. It's a women-led, focused and serving organization in Zimbabwe. A bit about myself. I'm a mouthful, hey? But I'm a person who's passionate about girls and women, and that's the work that we do with Mandla Foundation. We solely work with girls and women in the community around different issues, inclusion of sexual and reproductive health, HIV and AIDS, education, economic empowerment, leadership and governance. Public health activist, which is also why I'm currently pursuing my doctorate studies in public health. So soon I'll be officially be called Dr. Tadiwa, and I'm really passionate around issues of feminism. I'm also a writer, actually write for The Response. It's an online magazine and other different online magazine spaces. And thank you again for having me.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Tadiwa. And lastly, we'll have an introduction from Oluwatobi, who's joining in from Nigeria. So Oluwatobi, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Oluwatobi Ayodele from Nigeria, and I work with a feminist-led organization called Vision Spring Initiative. We are a national organization, and we work mainly with young women in their diversity to, disrupt patriarchy and analyze policies from a feminist perspective. And we also work on the advancement of sexual and reproductive health and rights for young women in their diversity in Nigeria. I'm a radical feminist and I'm a writer, and I'm excited to be here and joining the conversation.
Great, thank you. Thank you for those introductions. And to everyone listening, see, I told you we have an amazing group of young Africans who are doing incredible work. So I hope now you see what I was talking about. Okay, so just to get us started, again, this session is about where is the money, because it will then feed into the next conversation around what are the accountability mechanisms around this? How do we begin to see money allocated towards gender-based violence and towards violence against, ending violence against women and girls? And so just to start us off, I'll ask you, Nelly, to come in. So you're leading an amazing network in Kenya that is championing reproductive health and rights for adolescent girls and key populations. But we also know that your impact really spans even beyond the borders of Kenya. And we know how issues around lack of access to reproductive reproductive health services and products is one of the biggest forms of violence against women, one that many people might not recognize as violence, but it really is violence because it's violating reproductive rights issues. And so what is your experience in regard to the funding or financing for reproductive justice in your work, and funding around bodily autonomy, and how do the funding opportunities differ in the SRHR space? And to what extent do you feel that organizations have the freedom to choose the type of SRHR interventions that they would like to do? Knowing also that usually organizations that are working in communities have a better understanding of the issues on the ground. So what would you have to say around the SRHR funding landscape based off of the work that you've been doing?
Okay, thank you so much, Shalom. And I would start by noting that SRHR is one of the areas that is highly politicized when it comes to funding, especially in Africa, where we definitely depend so much on the Europe, for the Europe to support us. And we have seen a growth in the anti-SRHR organizations that are very active worldwide across Europe. And we've seen them also, trickle down to low and middle income countries. And this continues to affect the funding streams. What is my experience like? When I look back in 2017, when we had President Trump expand onto the famous global gag rule, and we saw limitation in terms of organizations that were supposed to get funding. And, while he knew that he was affecting abortion only, for example, any organization that was going to talk about abortion, was going to refer clients for abortion, would not definitely now get the funding. This affected a whole continuum of sexual and reproductive health service provision, and this includes gender-based violence, this includes HIV, this includes cancer screening, because when, as healthcare providers, a service provider-led organization, when we talk about SRHR, while I'm here advocating for funding, I'm not talking about funding for abortion only, I'm talking about integration of all these services. So when we have such policies in place, then that definitely affects women and affects girls. And just, a bit expansion on the same is that then this contributes to restrictive funding. We've seen donors that are funding certain items when it comes to SRHR, and they do not allow you to use that money for any other component. And I will talk, for example, PEPFAR, when it's funding HIV programs, they're very key, they're very specific that this funding is only going to support HIV, and anything else beyond, it is not going to take care of it. So what happens to gender-based violence victims? We need to build the capacity of healthcare providers to make sure that they have the right information and the know-how on how to take care of gender-based violence cases. We need to have a whole referral pathway that is very clear from the community to the healthcare facilities, and make sure that the facilities are well equipped, because when you talk about healthcare, it's a wholesale health system strengthening component, and it's a lot of pillars that we are looking at. So when we have donor restricting this funding, then that means that we continue to suffer. And, like one of the ministers said, during the generation equality funding, we saw a lot of commitments in saying that we are going to see a lot of grassroots getting this money. Sadly, this is not something we do not see every day. We have seen a lot of donors, mainstream donors, not trusting local-led organizations, grassroots organizations that are doing work around SRHR, that they are the real implementers. Then UHC, global, huge, that has been, continuously been talked about. We have seen a lot of, organizations that are talking about how UHC has supported SRHR. But when we interrogate it more, we realize that it has not fully incorporated the sexual and reproductive health components. And we are broadly, again, not narrowing down to one component. Then, how do we see, your next question, Shalom, was how do funding opportunities differ? And again, like I've said, organizations have limited power. When we talk about the real implementers, organizations in country, local organizations that are owned by women, you know, the right holders, the people who know what their problems problems are, they do not have the freedom. You know, when it comes to funding, they are not trusted. They are not provided so much funding that they require. And they also, at times, we see them lacking capacity, and this is because, for example, the INGOs that they work with are not intentional in capacity building. And that means that they continue to depend on the small handouts that they will get for different, you know, very small activities in implementations. And again, like I mentioned, donors not being flexible enough to allow integration of SRHR in their other strategic objective that they have. And then competition. I think donor competition has also contributed to us not being able to effectively provide these SRHR services that we continue to advocate for. So the challenges are really far and and broad, but for me, funding particularly is policy, donor restrictions, and not trusting locally led grassroots organizations. Shalom.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Nelly, for outlining all of those issues around donor restrictions, SRHR space being highly politicized, and so it becomes difficult really to plan. But you also mentioned something key, which was around this need for proper referral pathways. And I think it also ties in closely with the issue of the need for adequate funding, because those are systems that need to be in place, and they need adequate funding for them to operate smoothly and effectively. And so, in a way, one could see that there's really a lack of precise level of funding for gender-based violence in the wider protection landscape. It's often looked at as, you know, one thing, ending violence against women, gender-based violence, but not really enough precise attention to say, okay, for this to work, we're going to need, you know, this level of precise funding for specifically for referral pathways, for example, in order to make this smooth. So how do we reimagine funding for SRHR, especially for those precise things that need to be in place for us to start, you know, making strides towards ending violence against women and girls? So where do you see, or how do you reimagine funding for sexual reproductive health and rights going forward? You know, right before you answer, I also just want to call upon the other panelists. If you do have any additions to Nelly's question, or if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to do so once she's done answering this question. But yes, so looking at the need for precise level funding, how do we begin to reimagine funding for sexual reproductive health and rights?
So thank you, Shalom, again. So for me, one will be domestic funding. We've seen our governments make a lot of commitments when it comes to issues, gender-based violence. So we want to see them make a deliberate effort in terms of ensuring that we have domestic budget allocation for GBV. Number two, the Global South funding. It's also very critical for donors within the Global South to start prioritizing investments within the African region, especially in SRHR. And I will repeat, they need to trust the grassroots organizations and the locally led organizations that are doing the real work. Then political commitments. Politics need to promote and protect sexual and reproductive health rights for women. And we are not supposed to politicize women bodies, because every time we politicize women bodies, then that means we continue to see our women and girls suffer. So we want to see political commitment speaking to, the right, having a right-based approach, because we cannot separate the two. While you commit, make sure that you are protecting the rights the rights of women and girls. Then finally, my second last will be integration. We want to see donors being very flexible, and as they provide funding, they should not limit and restrict and only focus on one area, but make sure that it is an integrated support to SRHR. Then for sustainability, we want to see, again, donors believe and support local organizations and not fund them for 1 year and go away before we see the results. We want to see them commit and support locally led organizations for a period of 5 years, so that they're able to plan, implement, evaluate and be able to even document best practices that would have taken place between the implementing period. Thank you, Shalom.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nelly, for highlighting that. I think you mentioned something very key around political commitments, which is another issue, another big issue in this space where we're talking about ending violence against women and girls. And we have so many commitments, whether it's at national level, at regional level, across the different countries in Africa, but also at a global level. So we have documents such as the Maputo Protocol, we have the Beijing Declaration, we have the Human Rights Declaration, all of these documents that speak to, you know, ending violence against women and girls. But I think the question then becomes, do we see enough tangible efforts by our governments and by the players in this space to make sure that these commitments are enacted into action? Because having commitments is one thing, but actually coming up with a roadmap to say, here's how we intend on achieving this commitment, and being clear about it and being transparent and, you know, in a way that allows for accountability is also another. So that just came to mind as you were talking about commitments, but thank you so much for sharing. And so at this point, I'll just open up to the other panelists. Do we have any comments or questions for Nelly based on what she has just shared around the funding landscape for sector and how we can begin to funding for this? Just domestic funding. So this is funding that should be coming from the government, which she spoke about Global South funding, that also allows for, you know, not a lot of restrictions, but then trusting that local organizations will and can carry out the work. And then she also spoke about the commitments that are being made. So any comments from the panelists to add on to what Nelly has said?
I can come in, Shalom, just to add on to issues of funding. So, you know, just based on my experience, I've had the opportunity to work with the Gates Foundation and also, you know, leading the global She Decides movement. I'm also still a She Decides champion. And we have been doing some work, for example, let me start off with She Decides. So global movement and how She Decides started in 2017. They also mobilized different global stakeholders that committed so much money to really address issues around sexual reproductive health, but especially issues around unsafe abortion and access to safe abortion and so forth. So much money went to it. I think it was over $400 million was raised. And we as a movement, when we came together, we were asking those key questions in terms of where is this money going to go? At a global level, the commitments are made. Money, all the different governments, they've made them and they're committing to put this money to developing countries. But I think the key question is always like, we get excited in that moment when commitments are made, but then we need to really spend time to really work with these key stakeholders to understand how is this money going to be disseminated and actually put in the tracking measures to hold them accountable. So some of the work that we did as She Decides, we did work with these key global actors that committed financially, basically tracking with, even on our website, we had like a whole report showing, you know, this is where the money has been dispersed to. These organizations have received funding from that commitment to actually really show where this money is going to. And I think that's a really good step when it comes to accountability in holding global donors accountable. If you're saying you're getting this money to developing countries, who is it? And then being able to also have dialogues with them to say, but hey, have you actually thought about these other key stakeholders that are doing incredible work in these countries? So I think having, even us in the civil society organization, I think we should be able to open up dialogues and engage some of these platforms to say, hey, you know, if you're working in these countries, here is a database of local organizations working at a local level. So that's one area we should be thinking about in terms of when we on these different platforms, all of us working in this space, how do we also become an ally to some of these donors who make these commitments to say, hey, we have a database. I think you should consider working with these people at a local level. We work with them. They have impact and they should be driving these issues locally because that's where the issues are. The other second thing is work we did with She Decides was we also were at this place to say that, you know, this is a movement where where local stakeholders need to drive the agenda. And, you know, most global organizations, institutions always have an excuse to say, oh no, our policies cannot fund local organizations, our systems can't fund them, but it's possible to change systems. If you created those systems, you can change them. If you put those policies, you can change them. And I think just an example of just She Decides movement, you know, we were able to put those policies to say that we want small grants, which were called spark grants, to go to local movements in different country organizations. And we were able to put those systems and those policies in place. And I think that's what other institutions need to be doing than having to have an excuse to say, oh no, we only can fund INGOs working in these countries, because it's possible to change and make ways and measures to ensure that funding is going to local organizations. So that's just a few things I wanted to add. And I think I have seen that even working with Gates Foundation, where even though they are such a global foundation and mostly they fund international NGOs, with just a few dialogues we had with them, they were able to say, you know what, actually, let's actually look into finding opportunities to support global South youth-led organizations, for example. And they were able to put that in place. So I think having to push that dialogue with other big institutions, INGOs, to open up and to change some of these policies and institutions that they use as an excuse to not fund local grassroots organizations.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tikala. Yeah, I really agree with you. Systems can change. It's people who made the systems. So definitely people can change the systems. I think that's quite profound. I did see a couple of hands, but I think in the interest of time, we'll just proceed and then take all the questions at the end. So to the panelists, to people who are attending, you can either type in the question in the chat or just take note of it. And then when we open up for questions at the end, you can go ahead and ask. So Tikala, I think that was thank you so much, Nelly, for that. That was actually a good introduction to the questions that I'm about to ask you. So I know that you've been heavily involved in the Generation Equality Forum processes, from commitment formulation at national level, but also to tracking implementation and holding governments accountable and commitment makers accountable. So we know that at the forum, there was $40 million that was committed. So we want to know now what mechanisms have been put in place to ensure that this money is accounted for, particularly in ending violence against women and girls. And at the same time, the second part of your question is that you've just spoken about She Decides. So you've co-chaired a global movement before, and you understand the dynamics around funding. Like you're saying, some of the things you're saying, I think some of us on the call didn't really know that, okay, so we can actually challenge systems like that. So you've come to understand from the other side as well, the dynamics of funding. So what opportunities exist for reimagining funding for EVALG, and how do we begin to see more funding allocated? And I think you've already started telling us a little bit about that, but please go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks, Shalom. And just to start off, Shalom, it was not 40 million, it was 40 billion US dollars.
No.
So it is a lot of money. We're not talking about millions, we're talking on the billions. So I think just a quick intro for those who don't know. So Generation Equality Forum happened this year around, the first one happened in Mexico in March, and the other one happened around June, July. And it was just pretty much bringing global actors, civil society, youth, donor governments, head of states, pretty much together to advance issues of gender equality in different areas. And they formed like action coalition groups, one on gender-based violence, which is a key issue that we're talking about today, others on sexual reproductive health, technology, innovation, climate change, and so forth, right? So there was a lot of momentum being done in terms of getting key stakeholders to make critical commitments to accelerate issues of gender equality. And this was based on a global commitment from about 27 years ago, the Beijing commitment around women empowerment and gender equality. So now we have this big forum. Different organizations, global actors, head of governments have made commitments. And you know, interesting enough, most of the financial global commitments were either made from global INGOs, development agencies, but as well as head of states from the global south, right? I mean, not the global south, global north. And I sat there and I remember being in the forum and hearing all the different commitments that are being made. And it got me thinking that it's interesting that most global south head of states didn't make any financial commitment at a national level. And one thing that I always had thought to myself is that why isn't the global South head of states, let's just say African head of states, right, critically mobilizing their own domestic resources and finding ways to make critical commitments around advancing women and girls issues and gender equality within their own domestic resources at a national level, right? Because it's about prioritization. Because one thing that I've also noticed in this space is that a lot of our global South or African head of states, they wait for the global organizations to make the monetary commitment, knowing that money is going to flow to them. And then the money becomes political. So I just wanted to throw that out there for people to think about. I don't know if most people have noticed, but most of our head of states in Africa, you've never heard them say, you know, in our country, in Malawi, we are going to commit, we don't have much resources, but we're going to mobilize domestic resources and we'll put aside $200,000 equivalent to address issues of gender equality. Something to really think about, one. Two, the other thing around the Generation Equality Forum. So there were commitments about to 40 billion, right? I'm just going to throw quickly, I made a note of this. So World Bank committed up to about mobilizing and scaling up to $10 billion around issues of gender-based violence. The EU Commission, who's also the co-lead of the Action Coalition on GBV, pledged 190 million euros. Ford Foundation pledged about $260 million. And it's so much money, right? And it's, of course, again, the global INGOs, right? And when that moment happened, we ourselves have had an opportunity to be part of a national level in Malawi around commitments that the Malawi government should make, and those commitments were put forward. And from there, after commitments being put forward, we kept asking ourselves, so what are the next steps? We've had conversations, for example, with UN Women, who are a key driver to issues of the generation equality, but they were saying even UN Women at a country level, they depend on UN Women at a global level to allocate resources to go at a country level. UN Women at a global level depends on global actors like maybe Gates Foundation, World Bank to give funding to them, that then now goes down to UN Women at a country level. So when we start to really think of the funding streams, if you have 100 million committed at a global level from World Bank, you now get to the UN Women who probably will get maybe 50 million. And then when you get to a country level, maybe the country level is not only going to end up with like 1 million from that 100 million commitment. So I think we really need to be challenging global stakeholders, global donors. When you make this commitment, let's come up with clear funding streams that go down to the local level. Out of that 100 million, you find that a lot of these global INGOs will use so much of that money just for administration and salaries. Yet that money could go into building proper infrastructures, for example, safe homes for victims in gender-based violence, proper legal systems, right, to really support in the response for issues of GBV. So I think we need to be challenging global donors and even global actors who are committing so much money in this space to say, let's change the way you're funding issues around GBV or even issues around gender equality. The Generation Equality has put in place a global acceleration plan towards gender equality, which has put in measures around accountability and tracking some of the commitments that are being made. Myself, as Her Liberty, have had the opportunity to get some funding from Gates Foundation to do some tracking as well around those commitments, working with For Equality as well as a partner to this. But just saying that that alone, it's not enough. Yes, we've got a global acceleration plan to advance gender equality, to track commitments at a global level, but at a national level, we need to make sure we have that in place. I think even talking about generation equality itself, the people who know about it, it's only the people working in that space. How do we ensure that the Anti-Corruption Bureau in Malawi is part of tracking these commitments? If money is going to be coming in from global actors, they should be part of tracking that financial commitment. So how do we ensure that we bring in key local stakeholders, Malawi Health Equity Network, Global Health, Global, what was it? Women in Global Health, yes, which I'm also a member of. You know, they're amazing women who can take a lead in even tracking some of these issues, but we need to be bringing in local actors to really bring in accountability and track some of these things at a local level. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, wow, thank you so much, Tekela. You said quite a lot. I think it's quite insightful. Yeah, what is clear is, you know, there's a lot of money that seems seems to be allocated to ending violence against women, but we don't see it. And you mentioned something about the funding streams. You know, at the end of the day, now trickles as very little money because so much has been spent on salaries and other costs. And then you mentioned that, you know, we need to, I think as Africans, we need to challenge funding streams. And I'm just sitting here wondering, how does that even look like? Where do we start? You know, because this She Summit is about action. We want accountability. Where is the money that's supposed to be meant for this? We cannot have 40 billion, not million, 40 billion committed and only 1 million trickle to Malawi, for example. And so how do we begin to challenge these funding streams? What does that look like? So if we decide today that, okay, you know what, as civil society, we want to hold, you know, these commitment makers accountable and ensure that funding streams are revised to ensure that the money really trickles to where it should go in the amounts that make sense, in amounts that are adequate enough to challenge the issues that we're facing on the ground. So what does that look like? Very quickly before we move on to the next speaker.
Okay, so very quickly, I would say that this is why a lot of other institutions for our funding civil society organizations to strengthen accountability. So just for example, Asian Action Fund is a huge example that is really funding advocacy efforts led by civil society organizations to strengthen accountability and to track these commitments. So there are entities that are looking to support these efforts. I think secondly, also looking at a country level, how do we also as different civil society organizations work, for example, with the Ministry of Gender? Like, you know, we heard our Honorable Minister share in terms of the keen to work with others on this, in terms of putting those systems, because most of our governments, they're overwhelmed, right? There also may be technical gaps in actually putting those systems to track these commitments and to track the flow of this. We know that a lot of this work is so fragmented at a local level that different actors are getting money from different sources, and sometimes we don't even know how that flow is happening. So how do we invest financially? Those civil society organizations that have funding, how do we look into using that funding smartly in actually putting the systems and tracking these commitments and working in government to do that? How do we use the existing resources that we may have already as civil society to ensure that we're getting this information out there and we're bringing these key local stakeholders there as well? But I think most importantly, ensuring that even as civil society organization, we're able to even access the resources to support putting together these accountability measures. But in all, I think we can always use in our individual capacity, like a campaign we have now called It Starts With Me, It Starts With Women. How does individuals themselves begin to call out issues around budget and where money is going? So I think even in our individual capacities, in our social medias, we can begin to really question some of these spaces and some of these resources.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Tikala. I definitely agree. Working together is key. You would not believe how many organizations in Malawi are doing the same thing in the same communities, but at different times, one after the other. One will actually wait for this community to be done and then go into the same community with the same message. And so the question is, and I think it ties in with what I once heard about accountability. It's not just about holding others accountable, but also as people, locals working in communities, how are we also being accountable? Not maybe necessarily to do with money, but if we're saying we're bringing change, are we really bringing change? And can we hold ourselves accountable for that if we're not able to work together for the common good of the communities that we serve? So it's really something to think about. Accountability is a two-way street. It's not, yes, we want to hold them accountable for the funding and the finances, but also as people who are working in the communities, are we also being accountable in truly wanting to bring change? And we see that by, calling on each other. If we see that we're doing similar work, are we really working together to bring this change? So thank you so much for that, Tikala, very insightful. And so once again, if you do have questions or comments, please type them into the chat, write them down on paper. We'll have a brief, about 10 minutes just to take questions. And so you'll have an opportunity to bring those up. So at this point, I'd like to move to West Africa. Hello, Oluwatobi. So Vision Springs Initiative does a lot of work with young women, and recently you published the 25 years after Beijing Perspectives of Young Women report, which really analyzed the progress made across the BPFA's 12 areas of concern over the last 25 years. And so my question to you now is, how has lack of financing hindered progress in the realization of the BPFA strategic objectives? And what is the feminist alternative for disrupting the funding ecosystem to ensure that in 2026, GEF commitments are realized through adequate funding? You mentioned you're a very passionate and avid feminist, so would really be interested to hear, what do you think are some of the feminist alternatives to disrupting this space, this funding ecosystem, these funding streamlines that Tikala is talking about, the politicization of this space that Nelly spoke about? So what are the feminist alternatives really for disrupting this? And how has lack of financing hindered some of the progress? So over to you, Oluwatobi.
Thanks, Shalom, and thanks to Kala and Nelly for all the conversation so far. I've just been nodding my head and jotting down things. So this has really kick-started to be a great conversation. The 25 years perspective, 25 years after Beijing perspectives of young women was a report that we did during the Generation Equality Forum from March to June. And then we just really, recorded the gaps and analyzed how Nigeria has implemented the 12 critical areas of Beijing. And then we, it was reported and it was published, and you can download the publication on our website at vsinigeria.org. And you can just go through the publication yourself. But one thing we noticed during the analysis was that number one, the funding that has been going into ending violence against women and girls, especially in Nigeria and West Africa, is that it has been largely heteronormative, in the sense that as much as the funding was small, as much as the funding was less than 1%, most of it were largely heteronormative, ignoring violence against women, of persons with disability, persons with HIV, lesbian, bisexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, queer women, so all of these other groups and identities have been sidelined. And so funding has been largely heteronormative, and this goes to show that there is even a gap, in providing service, in providing finance to ending violence against women. And one of the things that the Generation Equality Forum brought about was, leaving no one behind, nothing about us without us, being all inclusive and all of that. And so the commitment, thank God, Tikala has already exposed our minds to how the funding system have been tickled and how this funding system goes. So we are able to know that even if it's $100 at the global level, it might be like 500,000 at the local level, at the grassroots level. So one thing that we need to do, first of all, is to denounce the heteronormativity and embrace collective funding ecosystem, not just as an act of tokenism, but from an human rights perspective. We need to recognize that if one gender identity or sexual orientation or persons with disability or HIV status are left behind, the GEF commitments cannot be achieved even by 2026. We cannot overlook the gaps, and we cannot overlook persons that are different from us by saying, because the face of the GEF is one particular group, so the funding must trickle down to that particular group. So it needs to be all inclusive. An alternative funding system that I would like to also highlight is recognizing collective care. There's a story in Nigeria of a particular group of women in the northern part of Nigeria about how they all contribute money together to save a woman that reports domestic violence. So there's this pause in the community where women just chip in whatever thing they have. And if any woman comes to say, my husband beats me or my partner beats me, they use that money, to help that particular woman. So that's grassroots activism in its way. They might not call it that. They might not even know that they are doing a collective form of care,
but they just, want to provide safe space for just that one woman in their community. So if all of this grassroots community does not look like global aid funding ecosystem, then how do we make sure that, are we saying that, do we build the capacity of grassroots organizing to fit into the global aid system, or do we decolonize global aid system to meet the needs of grassroots organizers? Because if we continue to say, oh, this organizing does not recognize outcome, does not recognize input and activities and whatever donor system requirements, do we continue to push them aside because it is not sophisticated? That way, by the time we get to 2026, we will not be achieving anything. By the time we reflect again, analyze and review again, we will be going back to the same way where Beijing started in 1995, and we realize that we are just taking 2 steps backward and 1 step forward. Even in the heat of the pandemic and in the global pandemic, we realize that violence increased in all its forms and in all countries. But despite that, funding was still very, 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 very little. Funding was still very, very little in terms of, funding, ending violence against women and girls. And this goes to show again that we might also, the global system or the global commitment might just be, talking and making noise about ending violence against women, about protecting, about including, while at the grassroots, there are women, there are organizers that are doing the actual work, but they are not being seen because, there's been a definition of sophisticated organizing, sophisticated community-led organization, and so they are thrown out of the bracket of being funded, which is very, very unhealthy, so to say. So we must recognize the diversity of underfunded organizers and movements. We must recognize the diversity of all forms of violence, really, because sometimes when we also talk about ending violence against women, we tend to mostly think about domestic violence first, and not acknowledging or recognizing that violence in all its forms is very is as valid as domestic violence. So we really need to, if we imagine and think beyond the level of where Beijing 1995 started, even at generation equality, we need to think beyond just reflecting on Beijing and adding a little bit of language on inclusiveness, tokenism, just to include one person. I mean, even the global commit, even the Generation Equality Forum, we saw what happened in March in Mexico, we saw what happened in Paris. It was not as represented, it was not as inclusive as we wanted it to be. Young people that were speaking were cut short. The opening ceremony was probably the most inclusive event at the Generation Equality Paris Forum. So what are we talking about? If the organizing is not even inclusive, how much more the funding and the funding ecosystem? So yeah, I'm just going to pause here for a while and allow discussions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Oluwatobi. Oh, yeah, you've mentioned quite a lot. Things that I also personally feel very strongly about, especially this issue of grassroots organization not being seen and this sophisticated organizing. And what came to mind as well as you were speaking was the issue of, do we even have GBV and eval experts who are coming from grassroots-led organizations in these funding processes, at global level? Not these experts or these sophisticated, global north people, but locals really who truly understand the issues at play. Because unless we have the right people who can represent the people who need this funding will always miss the goalpost at some point or the other. And so like what you're mentioning, to say, for the funding that does trickle to the continent, it's been heteronormative and it's ignored special groups of people who experience violence against women and girls and gender-based violence. So I think that was so profound, and it's very true. And you spoke about how the Generation Equality Forum is all about leaving no one behind, and yet you know, in essence, even as a continent, we're being left behind. The funding is not coming to us. The funding is remaining at the top. It's paying people's salaries, as Tikala said. So again, I think that the lack of precise level of funding for GBV and EVOG within the protection landscape is really driving a lot of the gaps that exist. There's not a precise level. It's just, you know, being considered as protection, or you know, just a blanket umbrella approach, and not really specific to look at the different communities, the different countries, the different needs of the different grassroots organizations. And so we really have a lot of work to do, I think, in standing our grounds, you know, and ensuring that there's true accountability, true transparency for this funding. Where is the money going? If 40 billion is being given, but we're only getting 1 million, it makes no sense. It really makes no sense.
It makes absolutely no sense. And I must say, I don't know if you were going to ask a question, or I can go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I think
I'm explain. Yeah.
I cited an example of a group of women, you know, in the northern part of Nigeria, bringing money together to just help one another. It goes to saying that, you know, we also need to take charge by ourselves. You know, if we keep pushing for justice, for decolonization in all its forms, we need to take charge by ourselves. If funding does not come to organizers that are in the grassroots, that are underrepresented, that are underfunded and marginalized, it must not be denied by people that look like us. It must not be denied by our own people. You know, imagine, for example, if one of the women in this community goes to the women to say, oh, I'm in need of help, and they cannot help because, you know, because of class or because of age or whatever status, you know, we must not keep denying ourselves of little care, of solidarity in as much ways that we can. You know, we need to also, I feel like we've left the provision and the tenacity of justice in the hands of people that we are still trying to be free from, you know, for so long. And that is why, especially for women and girls, in a system where oppression and microcolonialism still exist. So we cannot say that we keep relying on global funding, global humanitarian aid, without also reflecting and looking inward and asking ourselves, how can I hold my sister beside me? How can I hold the next person beside me? How can I hold this person that I recognize as my person, as my sister, as my brother? How can I hold this person? How can I help? You know, it's important we recognize solidarity in all its form and collective care. I think those are the ways I'm beginning to reimagine, you know, financing feminist organizing, especially when it comes to ending violence against women and girls.
Yeah, absolutely.
Shalom.
Yeah, I agree. Some of us might know Nyercia. She's always talking about how Africa is not poor. And I think as part of thinking about decolonizing aid, we really need to think about alternative ways of funding. You know, Africa is not, we do have some resources. We just need to prioritize and understand that, you know, some of these issues are a priority and they're actually getting in the way of development. I think Honorable Minister spoke about the need to look at this, you know, even as an investment in women and girls and in countries. And so unless we address some of these issues, we'll forever be going around in circles and relying on this aid. But it's time to decolonize our minds, decolonize the systems, and also think about, okay, so as we're waiting and pushing for this aid to speak to our needs, what can we do as a continent to ensure that we come up with alternative ways of funding? All right.
Exactly.
And so I'm being reminded time and time again that our time is not on our hands. And so I would like to ask Dr. Tadiwa to come in. So Dr. Tadiwa, you're a community mobilizer, a leader, leading a women's organization in Zimbabwe that is serving rural women predominantly. What is your interaction with the issue of funding, or rather in this case, the lack of funding? And what does the impact of lack of funding look like to the women that you work with?
Thank you, Shalom. In response to the question, I think when it comes to grassroots organization and community-based organization, we are the least funded. And I've also probably recognized as we are applying for proposals, when they're called for proposals, the requirements that are usually noted are really not fair or just to community-based organizations, we realized that big funding opportunities of something above 100,000 US dollars or euro is usually required for you to have a whole lot of requirements, which are quite impossible, especially to community-based organizations. We're looking at organizations that work in the community, and we work with volunteers. We work with women women individuals who probably don't have as much expertise, knowledge, as much as education hierarchy. You'd realize that being a community-based organization, you're working with young women and women in the community who are not as educated as you would have wanted them to be. You'd realize that in the community that you believe in and residing in, there are a whole lot of challenges that you go through. And recently there was, I would like to actually concur with what Tikala was saying regarding generational equality, around how not everyone knows about it. We had these conversations when we were having our Pasipemuti talks, which is a project that we implement. Basically, it's a bunch of us girls and women. We sit under a tree and we talk. And we're talking about the process of generational equality, trying to ensure that everyone is involved, everyone understands. And it was a big culture shock to understand that I would say all of them did not know what we were talking about. It was like we're talking something foreign, something they did not understand, which is why I came to realize that I think there's this assumption that community-based organizations have an understanding that the community knows exactly what's happening, that they are also following. There's this neglection that's being done when it comes to grassroots organizations, where we are the ones doing most of the groundwork. We're the foot soldiers. We're going out there in the community. We're putting as much as we can, but we're not funded. We're not supported. We're not being capacity strengthened. We are being ignored in the sense that we're not getting the capacity strengthening, the information, the skills, and the expertise that we might need to grow and develop as CBOs. Recently, the Zimbabwe government was going through the national budget formulation for 2022. And under a project that we're doing called Trust the Money for Health, with DAWA and support of RSM, we're mobilizing girls and women across the country to demand for this 15%, noting to the Abuja Declaration. There was a conversation earlier on with one of the panelists who talked about how the government needs to make a commitment to follow up to their promises or to follow up to what they would say they would do, or for them to actually mobilize resources to support the civil society organization themselves and not wait for European-based support. A lot of mobilization held. We were able to engage the parliamentary portfolio committees. We were able to present a position paper to that. Unfortunately, well, it was not exactly 15% that we would have wanted, but the budget that was allocated to health, which is one of the basic needs for girls and women in the community. The Zimbabwean government was able to place 12.8% of the national budget to health. So I think one of the work that needs to be followed up is not to be sure that accountability and transparency is noted. As noted earlier on, the 15 billion, when it's not being cascaded, you realize that we'd probably be getting $1 million. And from that $1 million, the community-based organization probably gets 5,000 from 50 billion. So there's a whole lot of commitment following that needs to be done. There's a whole lot of commitment that needs to be done. There's a whole lot of following up that needs to be ensured. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. But as I mentioned earlier, we are not capacitated. We don't have the knowledge and the expertise, and we sometimes struggle to fit in these national forums. It's difficult for community-based organizations to be included in certain forums that make decisions, that make a voice, that speak around what needs to be done in the community. You'd realize that it's really difficult. It's a lot of tokenism that's going on. It's a lot of who do you know that can probably link you with the organizers for you to also be included in that. So I think from looking around these issues on how we can probably readdress or reimagine financing, but putting special much focus on community-based organization. I'll strongly suggest that we need to revisit the funding requirements of community-based organization. When we make a call for funding, I think there's some requirements that I don't want to call them absurd, but they do sound absurd, knowing how much you're working with community-based organization and 3/4 of the secretariat are not as educated and don't have as much set skill. So I think there's a whole lot of capacity strengthening that needs to be done, a whole lot of organizing of the community-based organization to work together, to come together. I think it was Oluwatombi who talked about how one organization today go in the community talk about this, and then the following day, another organization go in the same community talking about the same thing. So there's need for coordination, proper organizing of community-based organizations that are working in the same community to mobilize their resources and work together and actually put their hands and their minds together to do work. You'd realize there's a whole lot of internal fighting. There's not internal fighting as such, but there's a whole lot of internal pulling and internal misunderstanding that happen with CBOs, where you struggle for them to work together, to form consortiums, and to probably apply for funding together and to work on the strengths and the weaknesses that they have together. So yeah, that's my 2 bits to that. Thank you, Shalom.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Tadiwa. I think you mentioned something key around, just adding on to the issues around this funding model. It seems like it's upside down. The funding should be more at grassroots level, because that's where we need these interventions and, less at the top. But then it's the other way around, where a lot of the money is really at the top and very little trickles down. You can only do so much with $5,000. And to make it worse, like someone was saying in the comments, they'll give you this $5,000 and tell you it's for a year or it's for 6 months, honestly. Yeah. So, all right. In the interest of time, that brings us to the end of this panel discussion. Thank you so much to our panelists. But before you go, I'm just going to quickly look at the comments that we have. And right after I'm done looking at the comments, the panelists will have just to respond to any urgent issues or just last minute comments, just 30 seconds each, really. So can I please ask Jessica to assist me in reading the comments? I got disconnected at some point, and so I've lost the comments, but I do have one from Patrick Wataka saying, how can we have the target communities participate in the funding of such projects that benefit them? We have realized we cannot always rely on foreign support. Besides, we need to own these projects and participate in their growth and execution. Let someone on this panel say something on this. So the question is, how can we have the target communities participate in the funding of such projects? So one panelist can maybe think about this question as Jessica reads some of the other comments to us. I have unfortunately lost the chat. Jessica, please come in and read the other comments. I think there was one from Jabulisile, and there was another one from, I think, Catherine, or is it Caroline, that I had quickly had a look at. So please read the comments that came in the chat, and then we'll quickly close because it's time to move to the next session. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Shalom. So I'll just quickly read the comment from Catherine, which says she does not regret attending this discussion, and really echoing the points that were made on the importance of funding, really the need for funding to trickle down to local community and grassroots organizations. And also she calls for the need to advocate for at least 5-year funding or so, because programming around behavior change, for example, cannot just be won in just a year or two, which is very important, and I totally agree with that. The other is the need for, there's someone asking for one of the panelists to speak on the need for our organizations to also sort of diversify funding, because we cannot depend or rely on foreign support systems. So I think we can, let me hand over to you, Shalom, for the panelists to answer.
Okay, great.
So, sorry, Shalom, if I can come in. There's one from Jabu, and she says another consideration is the tracking of illicit financial flows, and she references a UN report on economic development done in 2020, which says illegal outflows from the continent were valued at $48 billion, which is as much as what the continent gets as development aid. So she's really calling for the tracking of illicit financial flows. So maybe someone could also respond to that.
Great. Thank you so much, Wilson. All right, so I'm going to ask the panelists to come in. So you can decide if you'd like to respond to this question, and then just give us 30 seconds because we do need to move on. So Dr. Tadiwa, you could start, respond to any comments or questions that you'd like to, and then you close up, and then we go to Oluwatobi, and then we finish up with Tikala. So thank you, Dr. Tadiwa, Oluwatobi, and then Tikala. You may go ahead.
Thank you, Shalom. Am I audible? I had changed where I was sitting.
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I think I would respond to the last question: how can we target the community to participate in the funding of such projects that benefit them? I think what we can do is around community organizing. As CBOs, we need to be able to work together, form consortiums, coalitions and partnerships that allow us to work with our strengths. We need to also start looking around how we can look at the key issues that are being focused on and maybe writing proposals that are quite flexible to ensure that we can push forward an agenda that we're hoping to achieve as well. We also need to do a lot of advocacy work to demand our government to be able to support the work that we do financially as well as technical as well. So we now need to mobilize ourselves, put ourselves there, and start doing a lot of advocacy work to ensure that our government pitch in, and so that we don't just wait in for foreign support as well. So it's not something that's easy. It's not something that's going to be done overnight. So it's a lot of work that really needs to be done. But this is only possible when CBOs and the civil society organizations mobilize themselves, coordinate, and do a lot of mobilizing around that. And also in closing in, thank you, Shalom, and thank you to all the other guys from For Equality for inviting me. We're really excited to be here. Such intense and interesting conversations. Really looking forward to the next panel session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Tadiwa. 30 seconds or less.
Yes, thank you very much. I was just looking at the numbers that were estimated on illicit financial flow, $48 billion. And when we were talking about the GEF commitment, I think we mentioned around $40 billion. So it just goes to show how rich, albeit poor, we are in this continent. You know, we do not recognize the resources, the amount of wealth that we have. If our illicit financial flow, where is this money and where is it going to? If we have 48 billion USD and we have a lot of needs that need to be met, we have a lot of gaps in our public finance, in our public services that need to be, met, that need to be upgraded, that need to be fine-tuned to make it a system where every ordinary woman can walk in and get justice, can walk in and get safe and appropriate healthcare. Then we really need to have this conversation more. We need to broaden our minds. We need to ask questions about where our money is going to in this continent. So yes, I just want to end on that note to say that we have an amount of wealth in Africa that we are not using, and we need to start asking questions around that area. Thank you very much, Shalom, for this beautiful panel discussion, and thank you to all the panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, Oluwatobi. Tikala?
30 seconds is so short with everything I wanted to say, so I think I'll just say thank you for Equality for having us. And I think everyone else really touched on all the key questions that came on board, but I think most importantly, is for us in the issue of just saying as an individual where we're at, how can we use our own power and privilege that we have in our different spaces to challenge the funding flows, to also even challenge the national systems that we have, because even when we look at dependency of foreign aid and development aid, we also need to realize that most of our African countries, we don't have a strong tax base, and most of our countries are in debt. So reality is we somehow still need some sort of financial support, but countries and our national governments need to start prioritizing our money, but we need to also start strengthening our private sector and capital inflow, tax inflow, to be able to fund our own initiatives at a country level. But we have a long way to go. But other than that, thank you so much, and looking forward to always engaging with you all in our different spaces. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Tikala. Thank you, Oluwatobi. Thank you, Dr. Tadiwa. And thank you, Nelly. I think that what we can notice is that in our different capacities, these are issues we've been noticing for years, issues around funding, how it's not enough. How can we get $10,000 and we're meant to use it for a year? How do we expect to change behaviors? Like someone said in the comments, I saw a comment about, sometimes the funding comes and you expect you to do a behavior change project in 6 months with $10,000. How does that even make sense? So I think just coming together and hearing that, no, you're not alone. Everybody resonates with these issues. These are issues that are happening across the continent, different countries, different funders, but the same behavior we're tracing, across the funding streams. And so I think this is where it starts to say, as Africans, as young people, how do we then begin to challenge these systems? Can we work together on some accountability mechanisms? What's working in Zimbabwe, for example, in getting government to support some domestic funding, what's working in Malawi, what's working in Nigeria, etc. And that's where it starts. And that's why conversations like this are key. And so with that said, thank you so much. My name is Regari Shalom Zumuya, for Equality Programs Director, and I've been your moderator for this session. So I'll hand over to Jessica, who's going to give us a poem. And then thereafter, Wilson will come in with the second panel that's looking more into accountability mechanisms for financing, for ending violence against women and girls. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shalom. This panel has been so powerful, and I think a lot of the issues that will also be discussed in the next panel have already started talking about them. And I can see the fire in our panelists, and I can also see from the panelists that, we clearly did not have enough time to just tackle all the issues that we do need to talk about. We are making a slight change to the program, and that is that the poem is going to come after the panel, because we would like for this conversation to sort of just continue. And then we have all the key issues discussed now, and then at the end is when we're going to sort of simmer down and have the poem, and also share the storytelling session that we have lined up. So for now, I would like to hand over to Wilson, who is moderating our next panel, which is on reimagining accountability for ending violence against women financing and programming. And as you can see, that this panel is also related to the panel that we just had with our other experts. And I hope this, I know that this panel with all the experts we have lined up is also going to be exciting and also, fiery. So for now, let me hand over to Wilson to take us to the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I was really hoping that we get the poem now so that we can have a bit of a break, because this was such a heavy and intense conversation we just had, and I think people needed a few minutes just to, take it all in and really just, grab a cup of coffee and reconvene in a few minutes. So Jessica, can I ask that you just come in with the poem now, and then let's allow 2 minutes for us to, reset, and then we move on to the next panel. I hope that's okay.
All right. I think we can proceed and have the poem now, as opposed to at the end. So I guess because I'll just go right in. I don't quite sort of identify as a spoken word poem who is going to present a sequence of rhymes and rhythms, that are going to sort of satisfy you or leave you snapping your fingers and really enjoying that. I identify mostly as ranting kind of poet. I rant. I usually just speak and speak and speak, and I hope that you can also tap into the sentiment that I have behind this speech. I want to talk about the 16 Days of Activism themselves, which is, the going theme at the moment. A few years ago, we had launched the 16 Days of Activism campaign in Malawi. It was a very vibrant event, so colorful. And this was the year when I think the theme color was purple. We marched in the streets. We had the minister at the time give a very colorful speech. However, 7 days after that 16 Days of Activism, we received a report of a woman being violated, and this was a publicly done act of violence. It reminded me of the words that were spoken by several activists that said, "We work, we live, we march, we protest, we beg, but at the end of the day, we're still going to die before the violence ends." Last year, after the pandemic, we were slapped in the face with the case of a young girl violated by her father. The year before that, we were also slapped in the face with the case of a young girl violated in police custody. This year, we've been slapped in the face with more cases of young girls being violated by their fathers, violated by their uncles, violated by their brothers. We continue to live with all these perpetrators roaming free, because that is what we do here in Malawi. We let violent perpetrators, we let rapists roam the streets free. It makes me question who we are as a country. Is this part of our identity? Is this what we celebrate as the tradition we continue to throw in the faces of women every single time we try to live through our lives with our bodily autonomy? Every time we try to say that it wasn't because of the skirt that I wore, it wasn't because of where I was, it wasn't even because of the drinks that I was having, it simply was because of the man who made the decision. And every time a woman tries to say that, the Malawian society continues to say, this is against our tradition. Is our tradition to be violent? Is our tradition to punish women? Is that who we are as a nation? Is that our identity? I've been wondering about our identity as a country lately, because that can only be the justification for why we still have violence in the country. I don't know about you, but I would very much rather that violence not be a part of our identity. I want the president of Malawi to answer this question. Maybe some of you can answer this question. I want the Ministry of Gender to answer this question. Is violence a part of our identity? Is that why we continue to justify what is happening to women and girls? The 16 Days of Activism is great. It brings everybody together. It brings people together to talk about the violence. But then afterwards, what happens? Let me tell you what happens. I'd like, maybe as I conclude, I'd like to emphasize that this is not an attack on any government, but it is a statement calling for better, calling for honesty, maybe, calling for accountability. what exactly happened after the 16 days of activism? The government and the Ministry of Gender call for our funding, call for our support to implement the grand gesture of events during the 16 days. Yet afterwards, when we call on the government and the Ministry of Gender to respond to the violence, to maybe shed some light on why we still have violence, there's nothing. There's excuse after excuse after excuse. What exactly is it that you want from us? That's a question to the government. I would like to end there. A lot of this has to do with questioning the systems that are there and very that we need to be holding accountable.
Jessica, thank you so much. Unfortunately, you were breaking up quite a bit, so we couldn't hear, I think, the last bit of what you were sharing, but I hope you can be able to share that. I hope you can be able to share that poem, the write-up with us as well, because I think you raised some critical issues in that. So thank you so much for sharing that. We're going to jump straight into our next panel, which will be the last panel. Thank you so much for sticking with us. I know there's a lot of content coming your way, but we really thought it would be good to just, link the two conversations. The first one we've had on financing, but then I'll link it to the second one on accountability, because I think the two really have to go hand in hand. So this next panel is going to be on reimagining accountability for ending violence against women and girls. And we'll look at it from, all the different spectrums, really. And I'm really excited to be joined today by an incredible lineup of speakers and panelists who will be speaking to this issue. We are joined today by Mr. Joseph Kalelopiri, who is the principal gender officer in the Ministry of Gender in Malawi. We're joined by Kikanse Pile, who is a researcher, a consultant, and we're joined by Kenzani Motileni, who is a senior researcher at Social Justice Coalition in South Africa, and we're also joined by Yolanda Makani, who works with AAA Zambia accountability advocates, and they're doing such incredible work in Zambia. So colleagues, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. And I want us to jump straight to it so that we are able to keep track with time. And I want to start with you, Joseph. And when I start, maybe you can take another 30 seconds just to introduce yourself a little bit more. But I wanted to start this conversation with you and say, I think the moment we talk about accountability, and I know you work in the government, and you're always the first port of call, the first people that we want to pose the accountability question to as government. And I'm sure you've been in such conversations before. But I wanted to really start off by saying, I know the government of Malawi has really been progressive in terms of really making key commitments, championing, even with the Generation Equality Forum, Malawi is co-leading one of the 6 action coalitions, which I think is really fantastic and is a great thing that is happening. But my first question to really frame this conversation with you is this. I think one of the things that has been said quite a lot, and I know you've heard it quite a lot as well, is how Malawi has some of the most progressive laws, frameworks in the region. And I can attest to that, working in Malawi as well. But also in terms of, commitment making, like I'm saying, Malawi is really taking the lead in terms of really making commitments, key regional and global commitments. So my first question to you would be, there seems to be a disconnect, obviously, between the commitments that are being made and probably the implementation of that. Why is that so? Why are we struggling so much in terms of, really bringing the implementation up to speed with the commitments that are being made? And then also linked to that, is it is it an accountability issue? Is it a question that we do not have strong enough accountability mechanisms, both within maybe government, but also in other structures and systems outside of government, which are there to make sure that there is actual implementation of the commitments that are being made? So I want to start off with that question to you, Joseph, and then we can pick it up from there.
And thank you so much, Wilson, for having me. And good morning once again, everyone. I hope you are able to hear me.
Yes, we are loud and clear.
All right, thank you very much, Wilson. Indeed, this is a very important conversation that we need to engage in, especially during this time of the 16 days. And I'm glad to join this panel and also representing the ministry. I'm also privileged to work with government, the ministry, which is the coordinating entity for gender programs in Malawi. So to start with the question that you've asked, why do we seem to be slacking when it comes to implementation of the beautiful policies that we have? I think this is indeed an ongoing question which everyone wants to know. Why is this the case? Why is that so? Because we talk about this and it never seems to end. This is one of the issues that we really have been talking about. Now, for me, I would also have to start with some sort of a question. When you look at our policy environment, of course, we are talking about the laws and the policies and the strategies. The question is, do we really need all these policies, all these strategies, all the laws that we have? Because I think it has become a common practice now in Malawi that for every just single issue, we rush to have a policy. We rush to have a strategy. We always are in a hurry. There are things that we are looking at that we want to attain at shortest time possible without looking at the future or the consequences of what we're engaging into. So we seem to have at the moment several and so many policies and strategies, for example, for every single issue. Some are really just very small, but we seem not to be prepared enough to look at what is involved then when we come up with these kind of strategies, policies, and the laws. So linked to that question as to whether we really need all the policies and the laws that we have, the other question then that would bring us to begin to answer some of the questions. Why state? Because there then you begin to look at when it comes to holding each other to account. It is not just government. I think there are different stakeholders. This is indeed linking to the previous conversation that we've had, because there's a talk about government, there's talk about the donors, there's talk about the implementing partners, which are the NGOs. There's also a talk about the communities who are the beneficiaries themselves. When you look at all these stakeholders or all these important players, I believe that we have a shared responsibility of the blame as to why we are slackening in terms of implementation. Because from us as government, indeed, we have provided that kind of an enabling policy framework so that we are able to work, to implement, to undertake almost whatever that needs to be done in terms of responding to gender-based violence issues. But we fully understand it doesn't have to end there, because when we have all these commitments made, domesticated at local and country level, more work now rests on implementation. And that's where we have a lot of challenges. So of course, it goes back to the issue of do we have demonstrated political will and power? So this is political will that is not just talked about on the podium or talked about in parliament or talked about in various platforms that we are given. But this has to be demonstrated practically. For example, when you look at the national budget, does what is talked about on the podium correspond to what is contained in the budget statement? Because the budget is really the statement of government intent. what the government intends to do for that particular year. So if we go back to look at our national budget, the allocations towards addressing issues of gender-based violence, severe as the issue it is at the moment. But if there's no resources in the national budget, that does not demonstrate that we are a government that is committed to addressing these issues. If there's no funding, for example, to the national gender machinery to address these issues in the national budget, then we are not a government that is serious enough to address these kind of issues. So that kind of political will is very important, and that political will has to be demonstrated through concrete actions that must be undertaken by those that are responsible for allocating resources. But even when those resources have been allocated, that's where now it also comes an issue of where are they going, what purposes are those resources being used? Are they really serving the intended beneficiaries? Because those resources are for programs, for initiatives that are supposed to eradicate issues of gender-based violence and ever as we're talking about. So following up on what those resources, there could be little, there could be a substantive amount of resources, but following those resources and to hold those that are responsible for managing those resources to account. That is more important as well. So that is on the part of government, just one of the issues that needs to be done. And also, then you are bringing in into the picture the donor community, for example. What kind of, because when you have all these policies, sometimes we're only responding to a pressure from the donor, for example, to an interest by a donor. For us to be seen that we are doing something in Malawi, let's have a strategy, let's have a policy, let's have this and all that. We want quick wins, things that we can showcase results for within just a short period of time. So that also is one of the issues that has brought us in this current situation, that when you look at those that are responsible, we know government cannot do everything. We do not have all the resources. It was already talked about that our tax base is very limited. So it is not sufficient enough to address all the issues that we are addressing. That's why we bring into the picture donors and other, the NGOs and other players. Now, are we doing enough? Have we been doing enough, for example, that we can say that the resources that are coming into the country to that extent and level that we can say that if we are able to follow those resources, we are going to see a significant impact in terms on the issues that we are addressing. So I think there are several questions as well that we can raise: the interest, the kind of issues that we're always looking at, the kind of results that we want within just 1 or 2 months of a project. You want to showcase results. Then comes to the issues of the implementing partners. You have the CSOs, you have different community organizations, the community-based organizations, and all those. Are we working in with one voice? Are we using those resources as they are supposed to be? So there are those kind of questions, and then you go back to the communities as well. Are we conscientized enough that we can raise concerns, we can hold government and all the stakeholders to account? Because all these resources that are coming through different at government level, through donors, through NGOs, they go back to the community. For example, if our communities are well empowered, we have strong accountability mechanisms. I'm glad we are going to talk about the scorecards and all that. Our communities empowered enough that they are not just mere recipients, but then they can participate, they can challenge, to hold all of us to account. For example, if you go to a particular community, for example, they should be able to say, no, we don't want this because you've been here several times, but we don't seem to see an impact. And then they should be able to say, to direct exactly what they want to be done. So I think the question of accountability and why things have not been going very right is something that needs to be taken across all the different players. I'm sure that if we interrogate thoroughly what each one of us has been doing, we will be honest enough to say there's a blame that we're supposed to take. So this, when it is integrated into, I mean, the issue is not the absence of accountability mechanisms. Those mechanisms are there, but are they effective? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? So I think this question is very broad and very important. When we talk about reimagining, then it has to come back to us. I think we are talking about the 30 years. What have we been doing in these 30 years that we can change and do much better. So I think I'll be building up on some of these as we move, considering that I've taken a bit of time since it was my first question. Maybe just to give it a start, Wilson, and then we can hear from others.
Thank you so much, Joseph. There's so much to unpack from what you have just shared, and I really want to bring you back into the conversation quickly to touch on one other issue, yes, which you raised, and then we'll move on to the next panelist, and then I'll bring you back later on towards the end of the conversation. I think key issues you raised for me, the issue of political will, that yes, it has to be practical and not just podium statements. And I think that's an issue we're grappling with. And you also did talk a lot about donor interests, but so I wanted to touch on those two quick issues briefly and say, so in the context of us reimagining what accountability looks like as we build forward better, you know, and that's how we are framing this, because building back better seems to imply that the previous was good. No, we need to build forward better, recognizing that there's a lot of flaws from where we're coming from, but now this gives us an opportunity to now build forward better. So how do we then ensure that there is that alignment between donor interests and national and community level interests? How do we ensure, how do we align that? Because I think it's something that has been a huge gap for so many years. But then what sort of accountability mechanism should we use or should be in place to ensure that there is that alignment between the donor interest and the national and community interest? Is there room for us to sit, and who is sitting at that table if we're even having a conversation around alignment? Because I think the question then would come to say, what is the space for community leaders in that conversation for all the different sectors?
All right.
Because if those conversations are happening, evidently there are people who are missing from the table. So I think it's a really key question that I wanted you to touch on as well. How are our leaders using even their political muscle to influence some of those conversations in the interest of the communities that they are serving? So quickly touch on that in a minute or two, and then we move on to our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Wilson. So I think beginning from the community, there are spaces that are provided, because the way our system, for example, the decentralization system works in Malawi, or how that has been crafted, it is one that provides an opportunity, for example, for people from the community to contribute, to define their own problems, and then that all of us must be building up on that, because our planning system starts from there, so that at community level, they're able to define their problems, and these are taken up to the council and then up to the national level. But unfortunately, that's not how things happen. So maybe that be the other challenge, that do we as government, do we as stakeholders trust that when we go to the community, we do an assessment or a needs assessment, those issues that are coming from the community are what we need to take on board to implement, or we do not have confidence in what the community say because of poverty, because of illiteracy levels and other issues. That now, because it's not about everyone. You cannot bring on board everyone. You cannot take on board everyone. I think that's how our system has been developed at whatever level. So when you talk about at the government level, for example, we have the National Plan of Action to Combat Gender-Based Violence. Clearly articulates what needs to be done, our priority areas as a government, but how many stakeholders have used that to develop, to design programs and interventions? Because even in those documents, there are clear things that need to be done, that at national level, these are the systems and the structures. We have the technical working groups, we have different structures that are available, which are supposed to be multi-sectoral, so that we are able to sit in those committees to look at what are we doing as a country, who is not doing right. For example, if you are bringing programs into the country and we see they are not aligning with what has been indicated in the various documents, either strategies or policies, do we need a seat in those committees to look at those issues? Or sometimes the agenda is different. So maybe it is not the absence of those kind of structures, but maybe we need to change to strategically begin to do things differently. For example, if you have got these committees, we have these structures, let's redefine the agenda that is usually broad. We should not always be looking at reports or praising donors or whatsoever, but strategic issues. For example, to look at you are implementing these activities in Malawi. To what extent are these activities contributing to implementation of the strategies that are already in existence? Because unless we begin to track all that, then we'll always be talking about this and will not be moving anywhere. So I think we do not have a proper means of tracking. And as we are tracking, it means we are looking at the existing interventions, so that if there are rooms for change or for reprogramming, that must be done. But those are usually challenges. For example, when you're working with different stakeholders, they always tell you, no, our donor will not allow this. We did this, there's no room for replanning. Very few programs, for example, have a learning approach where you implement, you learn. As you are learning, you can change the design to tweak it in line with what is emerging from the community or from implementation of the program. So those are the kind of issues that we need to be talking about, that the issues that we are dealing with are issues that are fast evolving. So you cannot just use an approach that we designed 5 years ago and you think that will still be relevant this time around. We are dealing with people, we are dealing with the issues that are fast evolving. Our strategies as well must be crafted in such a way that they're able to take into account the nature of the issues that we're dealing with when it comes to ending violence against women and girls. So those are the kind of issues that need to be brought on the tables as we continue to discuss. Yeah.
No, thank you so much, Joseph. I really loved how you are framing this, and I think you've laid a very good foundation as we progress with this conversation. At this point, let me bring in Kikanse Bill into the conversation. KK, as I like to call her. Welcome to the conversation, and as you start off this, I would love for you to introduce yourself briefly, but as you respond to the question as well. And how I want to bring you into the conversation, KK, is to ask you a question around, Joseph already touched on this, the issue of scorecards. And, you know, we know that scorecards provide essential data that can be used as an accountability tool, but can also be used really to shape programming as well. Like Joseph was saying, you know, Malawi is that decentralization model where communities are supposed to define their problems. They're supposed to be tracking even progress that is being made. And I think community level, even national level scorecards help with that process a lot. So my question to you as someone who is a researcher is, how can we effectively use, you know, tools like scorecards to hold governments, to hold commitment makers, to even hold, you know, implementers accountable. Number one, for the commitments that are made, especially from a financial perspective point of view. How do we begin to use scorecards to track whether the money is trickling down? In the previous session, you know, a lot of the speakers were alluding to the fact that money is simply not trickling down to, you know, grassroots, community connected organizations who need it the most. So how do we track commitments, and how do we use scorecards as an accountability tool to track programming and measure the effectiveness of, you know, the and so forth, and also to issues of accountability mechanisms? Scorecards are one of them, but then what about the institutions themselves? How do we strengthen accountability institutions? You know, because Joseph did mention the fact that it's not that we don't have, you know, accountability mechanisms, but it's about effectiveness of these mechanisms. So how do we strengthen those mechanisms and institutions? I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I know you can be able to respond to that. So over to you, KK.
Well, thank you very much, Wilson. And I'm glad to be part of this panel. And thank you for Joseph for setting the tone. And I loved hearing that Malawi has, you know, strong accountability institutions. That's really, really amazing to hear. You asked me to introduce myself, so I will start there before answering some of your questions, which I may ask you to repeat, but I think I have a hang of them. I am Kikanse Pele. I am a researcher, a human rights lawyer, an attorney by training, as well as, I've mentioned that I'm a researcher. I'm also an educator. and literary activist, because I've co-founded the Gaborone Book Festival. And I think this is really an incredible session. I work for Accountability International as a programs manager. So Wilson, thank you again for inviting me to this very important panel in terms of discussions around the importance of scorecards, as well as really the importance of using scorecards to hold leaders accountable, as well as an intersection of strong, or building at least effective accountability mechanisms. So I'll answer part of your questions, and if I miss any of them, please feel free to remind me. I'll be glad to answer those. So in terms of the importance of scorecard, as we've already alluded to that, and Joseph has already alluded to that as well, is that scorecards themselves generate important data. And I think the question from the onset that we can ask ourselves is, how do we use that data effectively from scorecards? And really, in terms of scorecards, briefly, scorecards are incredible, particularly when communities are involved in generating that data, because we can never I can never really underestimate or overemphasize the importance of inclusion, of including those who are needed in terms of making input in such research. Because, for a long time, I would want to say that, and I'm open for correction, that a lot of research did not integrate and literally listen to the communities that that data is being generated towards. So it's very important to be inclusive and work with the communities, or work with people who the data that is being sought seeks to assist or engage with. So scorecards provide that, strict evidence that you're looking for, or data. And what is incredible about scorecards as well is that they will give you information that you are not necessarily looking for, which is really, one of those low-hanging fruits that you use when you have, that kind of data. And it's really important. If I may, Wilson, I would like to add that as part of my work, and we did a scorecard last year on African youth. It was done on Srhr, East and Southern Africa, and our findings were quite impressive. Some of them we knew that, by basic research, we knew that, we were likely to find this. And some of the findings were really what we didn't anticipate at all. So that is just to highlight the importance and the beauty of using scorecards to generate data. And you asked a very important question relating to how do we use scorecards as a tool of accountability. And I, as a researcher, I always like saying this, that there's nothing as important as evidence. There's nothing as important as data. So how do we use that? It's quite a simple answer, but it can also be an issue of geography. Who are you approaching with the data that you have from a scorecard or from scorecards? What kind of approach are you using? What kind of leaders are you approaching? What is the position in terms of, for example, the topic that we're talking about today, ending violence against women and girls? Because, like I said, geographies really matter. So you have to use strategies of approaching, for example, leaders, holding them accountable, but the question is, how do you use data? How do you use that data? How would it be received? Because sometimes we know very well, particularly in our African context, that a responsible position in terms of gender-based violence or LGBTI persons may be otherwise. So I always like saying that when you use information from scorecards, you have to engage people at different levels, using different approaches or using different methods, so that you can get the message across, so that you can get your advocacy strategies across, or at the medium level, raising awareness, because the data that you have also, it's a very, very important aspect of raising, awareness, education, as well as informing, whether it's your programming, whether it's at national level or it's at regional level. You also asked a question in terms of, the, financial accountability, which is one of contested issues in our continent. Where the funds going? Is it trickle down to people who are supposed to benefit from those funds, whether they are generated nationally or indigenously, or they are from donors across the world? So how do we hold leaders accountable in terms of finances? Is to really keep working, and I always say that it's also important to be able to approach those who are in the forefront, or who are leaders, particularly people who are supportive of the cause, and who are close to power or who are influential, as well as, I think what I've learned recently is that a lot of young people are very, very bold. Young people are very strong, and we must also use their voice to make our advocacy strategies more stronger, because we cannot leave anybody behind who is who's on the cause or who's supporting fundamental human rights, for example. So the issue about finances is that accountability mechanisms, for me, must form strategic collaborations and partnerships, because sometimes what is lacking within the institutions or people who can hold leaders accountable is technical expertise, sometimes the general knowledge. And I'll keep on going back to the strategies of approach, because those are very, very important in holding leaders accountable. So for me, it's an intersectional, as well as, there are many linkages in between there to say, well, if there has been, funds, how have they been used? And go back to the community and involve the community in that. So that, for example, if you are sending a delegate to a minister, or if you are sending a delegation to a ministry, there are people who know the language, who have, at least basic knowledge to be able to ask questions, to be able to present the data, to be able to say, well, these are the regional commitments that have been made, and this is what we have received, as a country or as an institution locally, but this has not trickled down to people who are supposed to benefit from it. Or alternatively, there hasn't been any impact, or there hasn't been any measures in place to see or to give evidence as to what has been achieved. So issues of also monitoring and evaluation are critical, are very key in holding leaders accountable, in also forming strong accountability mechanisms or institutions, because without those, then it becomes a great gap and challenge to be able to also hold others accountable. So Wilson, I'll stop there. I may be taking a long time than necessary. So if there are any questions that you asked previously and I didn't address, please feel free to share with me again.
Thank you, KK. No, you really answered all the questions, and I think I love how you're framing it around the linkages between the accountability mechanisms or institutions in that case with other stakeholders. Because like you said, you know, at community level, we can be tracking, but then maybe the expertise to then push for, you know, to advocate or so forth might not be there. So there is that need for those linkages so that there is sort of like a seamless, you know, integration across the spectrum so that, you know, the accountability process and mechanism is stronger. So thank you so much for bringing that in. I will come back to you in a bit, because I think some of the key issues that you raised tie to the question that I wanted to ask to Kensani Motileni, who is in South Africa. And you know, I love the work that Kensani, you are doing in South Africa with the Social Justice Coalition. You're also a researcher, and you know, the work that you do with informal communities and really democratizing, you know, those spaces and making sure that communities are speaking out and they are taking collective action to really change things and drive change from their communities upwards. So my question and how I want to bring into the conversation would be to say, you know, like I said, you have this long history as SJC of social justice campaigning, which is well documented, and I'm sure you can share with us some of the key social justice campaigns you've been running and the wins you have seen, because I know we've had, you know, conversations and we've shared some of the incredible work that you guys are doing. So what do you think are some of the strategies that you have used, which you can, you know, propose or profile as, you know, best practices that, you know, we can all look to as colleagues, you know, on this co-join from people from across the region. So what are some of these campaigns or strategies that you have used around how you've mobilized, you know, communities and, you know, really you know, harness their agency, their voice to really then begin to hold leaders accountable and drive change from that level? So what are some of those key things that you could share with us, which you believe are best practices, which you believe will also help us in our different contexts to drive change? So Kensani, welcome to the conversation. Please do introduce yourself first and then jump right into the question.
Okay, morning everybody. Thank you, Wilson, for hosting the summit and inviting us to the panel. Please just indicate if I am audible. I think I might be having a network issue, but please just indicate.
You are.
Okay, okay, thank you so much. Okay, so my name is Kensani. I'm from South Africa. I'm the head of research and policy at the Social Justice Coalition. And I think one of the most important things that the SJC has been good at doing is doing research, strategic impact litigation, as well as advocacy strategies all in one, right? So all our campaigns come from research. So we'll do your usual desktop research, but we'll also do focus groups within communities. And I think the most important thing in doing these focus groups in informal settlements is that we actually prioritizing experiences of people living in informal settlements, mainly women and children, like Black women and children, who are the most vulnerable people in society and in informal settlements as a community. So that is something that is very, very important to us, because even when legislation is out for public participation, we are able to say, but hang on, the lived realities of a woman staying in Nyercia, right? This is how your legislation is going to impact her. So you can't necessarily use a blanket approach when you're drafting legislation. You need to take into consideration that there are different people that will receive the information differently, or it will apply to them differently, right? So for example, a white woman living in the suburbs is able to call on the police whenever something is wrong, but in Nyercia, that's a different story, right? Because now there are no street names, there are no street numbers. nobody wants to do anything for residents of informal settlements because they live in informality. And that is the government's biggest tagline, that we don't have to do anything because you're living in informality. But we've actually been able to organize communities, do community capacity building workshops, right, through our political education unit. And for us, that is very, very important, so that when we take community members with us to parliament or to gatherings with government, for example, they're actually able to speak from a place of knowledge and from a place of facts, and they're actually able to produce the data. So I think that's something that we as the SJC have actually been able to achieve and actually continue doing the work, because we keep the fire burning on the ground, but we also go to courts and approach courts in terms of how do we actually hold government accountable. I heard Joseph talking about how it's great that they have all these laws and they would actually like to see them through. But also my question would then be, why is it always the burden of civil society, right, to hold government accountable? Why can't government implement its own policies? Why should we always police government? And when we police government, then government will file large documents in court to say, actually, we don't have money to implement this. So why is that there in the first place, right? So this is something, and it's a trend that we're seeing in South Africa, that whenever we approach the courts, instead of the government coming to actually talk to us and say, you know what, we see that Nyercia is in the top 5 of murders, rape, and sexual violence in South Africa. Let's talk. Instead, the minister will oppose the application, appeal when the finding is not in their favor, and then if the Concord finally makes a judgment, they don't even adhere to the court orders. So I think it's also time for government to also see, to actually define to us as citizens, what is accountability and what does accountability look like? And in respect of gender-based violence, I would like to just bring in this to say that, and this is something that we're trying to bring in our research as the SJC, to say that our police actually trained to prevent gender-based violence and murders in our communities, right? Or are they trained to respond to crime? So maybe our approach should then be equally focusing our efforts on prevention methods, in as much as we focus on how to respond, right? Now we need to have money to build prisons so that people can have justice. We need to build sexual offences court. But also, what does a society that is crime-free look like, right? So I think those are the conversations that are important for us to make, in the sense that we need to also work towards having communities and societies that are actually free from violence. Because at most, if somebody kills me, for example, at this point, the worst that could happen is that they will go to prison, and that's that on that, right? So I think also we need to take a step back and actually define the roles of people that are actually accountable, like who's actually accountable and who's actually responsible for the implementation, and also what does implementation look like? Because implementation for people living in suburbs in South Africa, like your Rondebosch and Sea Point, is different to what implementation and accountability would look like to someone living in informal settlements in Nyercia or Enyanga, for example, which is then deemed to be the murder capital in South Africa, where even police officers are even scared to get into that territory, right? So what does then accountability look like? What does protection? How do we then protect women and children in our communities when the very people who are supposed to be protecting us are the same people that are actually saying that, oh, ma'am, sorry, we cannot go to Enyanga because we're scared for our lives. So I'll just stop there and just see if Wilson does not have a further question. And I'm not sure if I've answered the questions that you've posed initially.
Thank you, Kensani. You know, I really love a lot of the things that you're talking about, and in particular, the issue of how do we, reimagine new alternatives, a totally different universe. We need to take a step back and start thinking, what would a society free from gender-based violence looks like? And I don't think we do that enough. I think, like you said, we're focused more on responding. So even the way we have structured our accountability mechanisms, the way we've structured our programming, is really to respond, but actually not reimagining what that could be like. And it reminds me of an exercise we did together a couple of weeks, was it a month back, when we were in Senegal and we were doing, reimagining or rethinking, feminist alternatives to the economy. What would, countries that have, good care economies, good, social services look like? And I think that process really helped us to step out of, what we are used to and really begin to think through what that could look like. And I think that's an approach we could start using and adopting in our programming, to take a step back and say, what would a GBV-free community look like? And then if we define what that looks like, then we start mapping our way towards what that could look like. So I want to put you on the spot and ask you to say, what does this community or this society free from GBV look like to you?
So, so this is a very controversial point I'm about to make, right? And it also comes from how I've just recently started actually engaging in abolitionist theory and literature, and how, like, everybody else is concerned about, oh, we need to put criminals in prison, right? We need to ensure that someone is punished. But how about we put our energy, right, towards creating societies where chances of being killed or murdered are quite slim, right? So that would ensure that actually we go to the root causes of crime. I think that we like to talk about what we think is wrong in society, but do we really know what is wrong in society? There's this perception that we need to rekindle the relationship that community members have with police officers. But was there actually a relationship in the first place? Have Black people or poor Black people in any time of their life had a good relationship with police? I mean, coming from apartheid, right? So do we actually even need policing? So these are the kind of things. Well, I don't have answers for your questions per se. But these are the questions that I have, and it's questions that I will be interrogating in my research work, like in the new year, to say that, do we actually even need police services in our societies? Because they're clearly causing more crime and more violence than actually good, right? What does society look like in the absence of something, or which is deemed as powerful and as responsive as a police ministry, for example? So sadly, I don't have, but I am starting to lean more to your abolitionist theory to say that we actually, prisons are actually not making a difference in society. And it's also a time for us to stop fooling ourselves and to start reimagining what justice actually look like for people that are actually victims and survivors of gender-based violence, but also thinking about how do we actually raise the next generation, right, to live in societies that are free from hate and violence. So these are the kind of things that we need to start thinking through as civil society, I would imagine, because clearly we are the backbone of everything and everyone in a country. So sadly, I don't have a straight answer for you, but I also have questions and alternatives that maybe we need to start thinking through as a collective.
Fantastic, thank you, Ketsani. And I'm just laughing because I think this conversation and where it's heading is, I think, the direction that our conversations need to go, just beyond the ordinary, but to really start deeply investigating the things that we have held dear and that we have believed to be key, and really evaluate, is it really key, or how do we transform that to actually make sure that it is delivering? I will bring in the other panelists. I see Joseph has raised his hand, and I will come back to you, Joseph, because I know you'd want to respond to that. Let me first of all bring in Yolanda into the conversation so that all the panelists have had a chance to speak, and then we'll come back to do another round of feedback. And Yolanda, hope Yolanda is online. But Yolanda, Yes, I can see Yolanda. Thank you. Yolanda works in Zambia, and again, they are doing some incredible work there. And you are part of a network, a youth network that is a lot of members, young people across Zambia that you are working with. And I know this conversation has really been around, accountability, even from community levels. And I think young people have a critical role to play in this whole discourse around accountability. So I just wanted to get a sense from you. What the perceptions of young people are in terms of accountability for ending violence against women and girls in Zambia, but also maybe if you have insights at a regional level. Are young people confident with the mechanisms we have? Do young people think that governments, civil society, and so forth are doing enough? And what are young people saying in terms of reimagining what accountability looks like? What would accountability look like to an 18-year-old Zambian girl right now if she's to think about accountability for Eva forward? So Yolanda, please come into the conversation. Feel free to introduce yourself, and over to you.
Thank you, Wilson. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Wilson, for the invitation and this opportunity to share and get to hear from everyone. I'm just going to dive into the question. I just kind of confirm if you can see my screen. I decided to do this just to show the information that I have for everyone. So just kindly confirm if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay. So I decided to just randomly go through, okay, I realized I didn't introduce myself. So I'm Yolanda Makane from Zambia, and I'm the Communications and Project Assistant Officer for Alliance for Accountability Advocates Zambia, simply AAAZ. I was so eager to just dive into the presentation, I even forgot to introduce myself. So I just decided to just randomly get the statistics for the GBV cases in Zambia. So if we can just go through, there's a total number of 4,042 cases of GBV, which are reported countrywide. And we have about 1,027 child victims which are abused. And out of those 1,027, we have about 850 who are girls. And also 2,437 are women. So the reason why I brought this up is to just give a better understanding to the perceptions that came from the youths, the young people that we work with, for everyone to understand why they gave out those perceptions. So I decided to actually engage, do a focused discussion with a number of youths in our circles. So these are the responses that they gave us in terms of their perception, in terms of accountability. So from the first response, they say that accountability for ending violence against women has a lot to do with legal frameworks. And we ought to understand whether these frameworks are accountable enough to address issues of GBV. And I can say that there's more of this similar kind of response. And there's also mention of need to strengthen legal and policy frameworks to prevent and respond to GBV. And then there are also some measures which are given below in terms of what to do, like rule of law and ending impunity for GBV, enhanced legislation indirectly which relates to GBV, and also advocating for Srhr and changing the norms and behavior that support GBV. So the reason why I decided to do this is because I thought it's best we get to hear from the young people themselves. So this is one of the responses from one of the young people. And then another person said accountability towards ending GBV against women has not been taken seriously by government specified institutions. And there's also an example which is given whereby not everyone is aware of the Anti-GBV Act that we have in Zambia. And another response was very little effort is being done to enhance accountability and protect women against violence. So pronouncements are made by the new government which is in, and there's little action which is made. So efforts must be made in regards to accountability, policies, protection of victims and survivors. And then the other one is most forms of violence against women and girls are not addressed. Most people only concentrate on physical harm as GBV, whilst there are more other forms of GBV. So I can simply say the last one is there's no accountability for ending violence in Zambia against women, because no proper follow-ups are done to make sure that the lawbreakers face the law, especially in rural areas. When it comes to civil cases, most of them are just around without being punished for their crimes. So I can say basically there's the young people, their perception is saying there's no proper accountability for ending violence against women and girls. So if we can try maybe using the National Accountability Framework to end violence against women and girls, I can say in Zambia, we can probably score 4 out of 10. From the 10 points on the checklist, I think we can probably be able to score 4. And scoring 4 won't be the proper score. It would just be like, you know, let's just give them a point, but it's not really properly followed according to the National Accountability Framework. I hope I'm still audible.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Okay, all right. So the second part of the question was, what is the government and CSOs doing enough? So it's a mixture of yes or no's, because from our perspective as Zambians, I would say some would say yes, because according to the statistics that I earlier on showed with the previous year, there's been a reduction on numbers on the GBV cases. So someone can argue and say, yes, the CSOs and the government are doing enough. But then on the other end, someone can argue and say, no, we are not doing enough, because still the numbers, the GBV case numbers are still high. So however, what needs to be done, I know this is specifically best for Zambia setup, but then it may not really apply for the region itself, but I think some of the points here can apply. So what we can do to reimagine accountability to ensure that we build forward is there's need for legal frameworks to be implemented, reinforcement of policies. So the reason why I'm saying this is speaking from the Zambia point of view, we have the Anti-GBV Act, and going through it, if I can just go to the next page, it talks about there's an anti-GBV committee, which has more like expectations of what they're supposed to do. So this is a good policy. This is a good legal framework. And there's even also a mention of anti-GBV fund, which caters for basic material support for victims, and also monies from the parliament, which are used for anything that the GBV victims may need. So policies are there in Zambia, but then there's need to implement them, or rather enforce them. And also the other issue is there's a bit of corruption, or rather I would say perception from society, where a lawbreaker is probably the breadwinner. And the moment that someone reports on them for doing, for a GBV case, the dependents or the family members who then go to the police station and beg the police officers to release the person because he is the breadwinner. So there's that perception where there's needs to be, and lawbreakers are supposed be arrested and charged, especially in rural areas, despite of the family or the mother comes to beg. If someone breaks the law, I believe they should just face their charge of what they've done. And also another thing that can be done is judicial processes must be transparent and quick in addressing such issues. There's also need for changing the narrative of violence against women. And there's need to establish a proper anti-GBV fund, which would benefit or support the GBV victims. And then also establish an anti-GBV committee and establish an effective accountability mechanism framework for ending violence against women and girls that provides checks and balances for institutions such as the police, judicial systems, government, and the CSOs themselves. So we do have CSOs in Zambia that are doing projects around GBV, but I feel that there's need for some sort of accountability in these CSOs. The monies that they are receiving for GBV projects, are they fully spent on the specific activities or things they're supposed to do? And also there's need for a continuation of capacity building training for the police force on GBV so that they can know how to address cases of GBV. So I'll just give an example on the last point that just recently in Zambia, we had the police force going for a training on basic GBV, how to handle, how to file such cases, and how do you charge someone like that. So I was asking myself to say, okay, so what were they doing before? How were they handling such cases way before? And then it came to my attention to realize, to say, why hasn't this been something that the police force does throughout the time? Why does it have to be an event or a capacity building training that is only done during the 16 days of GBV? So which actually made me to get more interested to be part of this discussion when I saw the theme of saying 16 days to 365. I feel that there's need of making these GBV issues, ending violence against women, more of an issue that we deal with or work on for the entire year throughout, not just during this period from the 25th of November to the 10th of December. So I think this is all I had. Thank you for this opportunity. I hope I wasn't too fast. Any questions, please?
No, thank you so much, Yolanda, for the presentation, and I really loved how you brought out the voices of young people in this, around what their perceptions are, and I think you bring in a lot of key issues. Interestingly, you also highlight the issue of the police as an important institution, accountability institution, but really ask questions around, are they well trained? Are they, what exactly is the structure? I know Kensani had also raised that issue, and Joseph had wanted to come in. So what I will do now is I'll ask Joseph to come in to respond or add on to some of the issues raised. And then I'll also ask Kensani and Kikanse if they have other contributions they would want to make. And then Yolanda, you can come in. And then if we can just do it quickly, then I see there's one raised hand, which I'll also bring into the conversation immediately after that as we close. So Joseph, please come.
All right, thank you so much, Wilson. I wanted to respond to a few issues that Katz raised, and which are very pertinent. First of all, to look at as government, are there mechanisms for holding ourselves to account? So first of all, I wanted to say that there are mechanisms, and I think recently what we've been doing in Malawi, we have been trying to develop what is called to do the essential services package for GBV. Now, what we've done with that is we've gone beyond developing the essential services package, because that really details what stakeholders, what survivors, and everyone must expect when, for example, they come to police, they come to a medical personnel, when they come to when they get the interface a social affairs officer, the kind of issues that they would expect at a minimum in terms of addressing gender-based violence. So that's how, as government, would want to be held to account. For example, if you are meeting a social worker and this social worker is supposed to provide a psychosocial support and counseling, we've provided the minimum standards. A police officer as well, there are minimum standards for police officers handling GBV issues. Now, attached to the essential services package, we have also developed a scorecard. This is a scorecard for the communities to use to hold government to account, but also we're moving beyond, for example, at central level to look at what issues we can do with the other government ministries and stakeholders. For example, as the Ministry of Gender, which is the institution that is responsible for implementation of GBV-related activities, would want to make sure that we hold to account, for example, the judiciary, Ministry of Justice, police, if they are implementing eval or GBV-related interventions in their programming. We want to see to what extent are those responding, or what are the bottlenecks, or how those can be addressed. So there are mechanisms, yes, that are meant to hold governments to account, but I think still there's more that needs to be done, because there are other constitutional bodies. I'm sure that in each and every country, there are national human rights institutions, for example, the human rights commissions. These are very important entities if they are empowered, because they also come in to hold even ourselves as a ministry, for example, to account for not doing certain things and other other players. So this is a very important discussion to have. But I think investing in this kind of in mechanisms that can bring all of us to account is what is a challenge. I would go down to break this even further, for example, to go down to the communities. In Malawi, you cannot implement a project or a program without going through a district setup or a district structure. And even you can't go to a community without you going through this structure. What has been a challenge, I think, that is killing this accountability mechanisms, maybe would say that to some extent, an aspect where people expect an allowance, expect to get some sort of an incentive for doing something that is of benefit to them, to some extent is also not helping us, because if you want to do a scorecard with community members, by the end of that time, they would expect to be paid. Or if there are no incentives, there will be no participation from people. Now that also defeats the purpose of doing, for example, scorecards, because if you are paying someone to, for example, to do a scorecard, they only give you what you want to hear because there's an incentive behind. But if our programming was such that it takes away these kind of other incentives that are provided, then we'll be sure that people are providing their objective assessments, so that if those alternative options are taken on board, they would help us to improve some of our programming. So just some of the issues that I wanted to say, and also to say that I think maybe let me stop there. But one other important aspect I wanted to emphasize is that I'm sure, just as to agree with what Yolanda said, how we may not have a uniform kind of an approach in each and every country, because the issues that, for example, in South Africa, Kekat was addressing would be different from what we are experiencing, what is our problem in Malawi. But also the funding levels, how much South Africa allocates, for example, towards GBV issues would be different in Malawi. So I think we have to look at what is the current situation for each and every country, and that we move, we use that as a benchmark or to improve on what has to be done. Otherwise, the contexts are different, as much as some issues may be the same, but still more, there has to be context specific. So just to start as well, to put it that way, Wilson, thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Yeah, and I think the importance of such conversations, which are regional in nature, is for us to look at what's working in country A, how can we learn from that, and so forth, taking into full consideration and understanding that obviously our context will be different, but really to look into what are some of the best practice that we could be learning from what others are doing. KK, I see you have unmuted yourself. Do you want to come in? I'm also mindful of the fact that we've gone out of time actually, but I want to bring in all the panelists maybe to give sort of a 1 minute closing remark or just a response to some of the pertinent issues that came up before we close the panel. So KK, I see your mic is unmuted. You can come in. Then Kensani, you can come in after that, and Yolanda, you can come in last. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Wilson. I would really like to say to Nkensani that she brought in a very important question for reflection as to why do we still need to police government to be accountable. So I think that's a really great question for reflection. So in making an input at the end, and I think like Joseph said, geographics are very different, but what we realize, particularly in the African context, is that there are issues, like Nkensani said, of policing the government to be accountable for all our commitments. So what is needed to be done is that, those who are holding leaders and governments accountable, let's continue to do it. Let's keep going. Let's keep voicing it out until something happens. For me, I think that's the most important part. Let's be consistent. Let us have dialogues. Let us collaborate. Let there be partnerships across the countries because our issues are similar. So that is the input that I would have. And thank you very much, Wilson, for inviting me. I enjoyed being part of this panel. And thank you to the panelists as well.
Thank you, KK. Kensani?
Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, so I think this is quite an interesting topic, and we could literally go on the whole day about it. But just to touch on what Joseph was saying is that in South Africa, we really lack the political will to do anything. I mean, we had a Kalicha Commission of Inquiry report released in 2014, and one of the main recommendations was that they had to build a police station in Makaza, right? The crime stats since 2014 show that we need an extra police station there, and because the current ones are understaffed. We only got a mobile police station a day before elections. Local elections in November now. So I think also it's very important for our political leaders to also just engage us, right? Because we're not engaging them in bad faith, but it's important for all of us to sit together because clearly we understand the issues of the people on the ground, right? So what is it that they can learn from us and what can we learn from them and what are their challenges? So that when we go back to our communities, we can actually also communicate these challenges so that they can be an understanding between communities, civil society, and government. So for me, I think that is something that is very, very important. In as much as we fight against government, but at the end of the day, our main goal is to ensure that everybody, especially women and children and people that are differently able, live in a society that is free from violence and hate. So I'll end it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kensani. I will ask Yolanda to come in and give you a parting shot.
Thank you, Wilson. So for my closing remarks, I would answer a question from Joseph. It says, Yolanda, you mentioned about the accountability framework for Zambia. Would you kindly share that? So those points I gave out are not the actual things that we have here. Those are the suggestions that we thought would help us as Zambia to have a proper accountable government, or making sure that we are able to have accountability that ends violence against women and girls. So this is something that was suggested rather would work out to deal with the issue that we have at the moment. I hope that is clarified.
Yeah, I think that's clear, Yolanda. And I think also that actually highlights the need for us to have those sort of frameworks at national level that we could be referencing and using. So thank you for you guys suggesting that. And I hope you actually work on it. Hopefully next time we have a similar conversation, you guys can be able to be sharing that as a reference point for all of us. I see there was a hand that was raised, but I seen it has gone down. But I'll read a comment from Bitumelo as I wrap this up. And I think she references that the issue that Kensani raised around police officers being trained to prevent GBV, or are they trained to respond to crime? And she was just alluding to the fact that it's a really critical issue, and that the training that GBV is a crime is such an important part of police training, because one of their mandates is crime prevention. If they can see GBV as more than a family problem or private matter that victims should go home and discuss or work through with their abusers, but rather as an actual crime that they are employed to prevent, and to really investigate and even arrest individuals. So she's really alluding to the fact that it's such a key issue that needs to be looked into. Without any more questions, I don't see any questions on the chat. Let me take this opportunity to thank you, colleagues, Yolanda, Kikanse, Kensani, and Joseph, for taking time to join us and really adding your voices to this conversation around accountability. And I think for us, what has been key is really listening through to your key recommendations, the best practices that you all have been sharing, and we are capturing that, and we will be sharing the report of this soon, because we hope that we can use this as a framework or something that we can refer to as we are implementing, as we are doing what we're doing in our different contexts, to say, what are our colleagues doing? How is it went? How can we contextualize it so that we actually, strengthen our accountability mechanisms and make sure that we do have stronger institutions and stronger frameworks in place. So, colleagues, thank you very much for being a part of this panel. It's been a pleasure moderating it, and I look forward to engaging with you all again soon. I'll hand over to Jessica as we're about to wrap up this summit. Our apologies that we've gone a little bit over time, but I think in the next 10 minutes we would have wrapped up. So please stay with us for the next few minutes as we wrap up with something very exciting to show you, which Jessica, I think, should be able to.
Thank you so much, Wilson. I hope you can hear me now. Just checking, Wilson, am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that, Joseph. Thank you very much for that panel, Wilson, and also to our panelists. That was a very exciting panel, and there's so much that has come up from that panel. That also relates to the first panel, which was on financing for ending violence against women. We will be consolidating all of the key points that have come up in this discussion, and then we'll proceed to share that with everybody. We do also know that this is a conversation that we cannot just have now and end it here. This is a conversation that is going to continue, and we will also be hosting several platforms starting from January next year, where we will be continuing this conversation. And we'll also be looking to collaborate with, our partners nationally and regionally to just really boil down to the issue of reimagining financing and accountability for programming on ending violence against the women and girls. I'm going to share my screen so that we can now listen to the different stories and experiences that we did have the opportunity to curate from our different partners across Africa. And so I hope you can see it. If you cannot see my screen, please do let me know so that I can work on that. Otherwise, please do enjoy this. You can see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I hope you enjoy this video that we put together. My apologies for that. There was no sound in the video. Let me just check on that.
All right, thank you, Jessica. Yeah, while you check on that, if we still have a problem with it, we will upload it on our YouTube and share the link. So we will share the link on our social media. If we are not able to play it now, and then you can always watch it on our YouTube channel. So Jessica, maybe we can proceed to wrap up since we're already out of time, and then we can share the video on YouTube immediately after this.
I'm sorry, I fixed the sound issue.
Oh, fantastic.
So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
As part of the third annual She Summit, we asked advocates and activists from across Africa to share their stories and their experiences from their communities regarding violence against women. We know that with each crisis, rates of violence against women. This has been the theme for the global pandemic. Rates of violence have drastically increased since the onset of COVID-19 in early 2020. This has seen to many organizations and shelters shutting down due to COVID-19 preventative measures, as well as restrictive and limited funding, as a lot of funding was redirected to COVID-19 response. This presents an opportunity for discussion and interrogation as to why the response to violence against women growth not exceeded the global COVID-19, and especially why very little funding has been allocated to responding to incidences of gender-based violence. My name is KB, and I'm from Lagos State, Nigeria. Lagos is the most populated city in Nigeria. It has an estimated population of about 20 million people.
I think we're having problem with the internet connection from Jessica's end. So I've just been advised that we will be pausing the video. So we will post it on our YouTube. Apologies for that. And we'll share the link with all of you so that you can be able to appreciate the stories that are coming from across Africa. I don't know if Jessica is back on so that she concludes for us. But if not, let me ask Jennifer Lipenga to just come in and give a roundup of the key issues that have come up, which will be reflected in the report that we'll be producing, and we will be closing off for the day. Jenny.
Thank you, Wilson. So I'm just going to share some of the key issues that came up, and like Wilson said, we're going to share everything else in the report. So I'm just going to look at some of the key issues. So one of the key issues under funding is that we need to fund grassroots organizations, and we need to make sure that we build their capacity so that they're able to respond to the call for applications that come out from the global South. And also African leaders need to commit to funding local organizations and the ministries such as the Ministry of Gender, and to be able to fund the gender machinery in the different countries. And for the donors as well, we need to make sure that they're funding us for a longer period of time, because a year-long funding is not enough. We need to make sure that they're funding at least 5 years for us to be able to properly implement our projects. And we need to make sure that we're tracking the funding that's coming out to make sure that it's going to the right people and people are benefiting from the funding that's coming out. And moving on, we also need to be We need to be challenging global stakeholders and donors to develop clear funding streams that trickle down to the local organizations. And just a second. And under accountability, for the budgets, we need to make sure that our leaders are also showing their commitment through the budgets that come out, because if it's not coming out in the budget, then that means that it's not really going to be implemented. It's not going to translate into action. And we need to make sure that people in the communities are empowered to challenge and interrogate some of these policies and initiatives that we're bringing to them. And accountability also needs to happen at individual level. As organizations as well, we need to make sure that we're holding each other accountable and not just holding the government, but ourselves. And communities should be able to challenge and question some of the projects that we're bringing to them. And there's a need to also think about strategically changing our programming, because for the strategies that we might have had years ago, it might not be feasible to do them now. So we need to reprogram and see how best to approach some of the emerging issues that are coming out. And for the accountability as well, under the scorecard, we need to make sure that we're engaging local people in the communities so that they share some of the issues that they are being affected by, and that the data that we have is being used to speak to the policies and our advocacy plans. We should also be looking at what our accountability looks like for us and some of the responses that we have. We need to be able to define societies that are free. What does that mean to us, and what actions do we need to take to make sure that we're creating societies and communities that are free from gender-based violence? So another key issue that came up towards the end is that we need to make sure that as the continent, we're sharing some of our best practices so that we learn from each other, especially in terms of accountability strategies. Some countries might have them, some countries might not. So we need to share some of the accountability strategies that we have, and also making sure that we're following up on the strategies that we have, so that we don't just have strategies that are not working and we're not following up. And more importantly, we need to make sure that we're working collectively to hold each other accountable, and also the donors and our governments. So we are going to share the reports. These are just some of the key issues that I can say right now because of time, but this will be shared with you guys in due course. So back to you, Wilson.
Thank you, Jenny. I took over Jessica's job of hosting this session, but in the interest of time, let me just really extend our thanks to all of you for joining this conversation today. On behalf of the entire team at For Equality, we were really excited that you were able to join us. We really had such an insightful conversation, and I think the feedback that we're getting as well, even on social media, because I know we're live tweeting, and there's quite a lot of great feedback that has been coming from the conversations that we've been having. Just to also highlight that this conversation doesn't end here. Sometime in between January and February, we'll be convening follow-up conversations from this conversation in what we're calling think pods, where we are going to now have sessions where we are going to do a lot more around reimagining, around co-creating new realities and what that looks like. Remember, the theme for this summit was around from 16 days to 365 days. So this conversation should not end around 16 days of activism, but should be work that we're consistently and continuously doing, which I know a lot of us are already doing, but we need to intensify those efforts. So we'll be inviting you again back into this space for those focused think pods, where we'll really be taking a bit more time to focus on financing as an issue, and then focus on accountability as an issue, now to really reframe that and really restart reimagining the whole context. Because today I think we did very well in really identifying and analyzing the current framework, the current system, what it looks like. This has really provided that good background for us. Now going forward, like Kensani, I love what Kensani said, to say we need to now start thinking or reimagining a future of a community, a society in Africa that is free from gender-based violence. So that is what we'll be doing in the upcoming sessions, which we are calling our Think Pods. So please expect that invitation from us. We'll be sharing more details on the dates, but would really enjoy if all of us who were here and others as well were not in this initial conversation would be able to join us. So once again, our sincere gratitude to all of you, but also to our guest of honor who had to leave the meeting early to join another meeting that is happening. Honorable Minister Patricia Kaliati, we are so grateful. I know Joseph and colleagues, some of the colleagues from the ministry are still here. Please do convey our gratitude again to her and to all the government officials who were here. Thank you so much for joining us, all the speakers, the panelists that we had. I was tweeting about this, in fact, before this, and I said, you know, this is going to be a fire conversation, and it really proved to be that. It was really rich conversation. So thank you so much to all our panelists who really richly spoke to the issues that we had. And lastly, thank you, last but not least, definitely, thank you to everyone who joined in. So have a wonderful day. We'll be ending the call now, but we look forward to engaging with you more. Watch out for the video on YouTube. We'll be sharing the links today so that you can watch that video on YouTube as well. So thank you so much and see you again soon. Bye-bye.